for the rest of the country, it's a special extended edition of Power in Politics. Plus,
I've been firm, I've been clear, but I don't think descending into insults is right for the way Canada engages with the world.
Summit Showdown. G7 leaders are arriving in Quebec. U.S. President Trump, though, is reportedly miffed about going. Allies are expected to grill him over his metal tariffs. We'll go to Quebec to gauge the mood. Then,
the whole issue of legalizing marijuana is all about risk.
I'm very concerned about delaying the legislation.
high times on the Hill. The Senate is expected to vote tonight on the government's marijuana bill. Conservatives want to delay legalization, but they're outnumbered. We're watching the upper chamber and we'll bring you developments as they happen. Hello and welcome to this special edition of Power in Politics. I'm Vassy Kapelos and we are live from outside the CBC Broadcasting Centre in Toronto. Just a few blocks away from Queen's Park, where polls suggest a new government could take the reins after 15 years of Liberal rule in this province. It's election day here in Ontario and several million people have either already cast their ballots or are on their way to their polling stations. Our countdown clock is on. Voting ends in 4 hours in most parts of the province, and a lot is at stake in this election, not just for Ontario, but for the rest of the country. And we'll be discussing all of it over the next 3 hours. We've got our panel of party strategists to discuss the swings and the misses of this campaign, and our number cruncher, Eric Grenier, is tracking the must-watch ridings. Plus, what are the candidates thinking and feeling at this moment? We've assembled 3 former premiers for that perspective. But first, we've got reporters staked out at all 3 campaign headquarters. That's where we begin our coverage this evening. The CBC's Mike Crawley is with the PCs, Chris Glover is on the NDP floor, and Lisa Shing joins us from the Liberal camp. Let's begin with Mike Crawley. He's at the Toronto Congress Centre, as we mentioned, with the PC party. Mike, there are projections, including the CBC poll trackers, that suggest the PCs have a good shot at a majority. How confident are they?
Well, certainly the PC's internal numbers as well are suggesting they could end up in the high 60s or low 70s. 63 is the number that they need for a majority. I would say that they are confident but not overconfident. A big effort today around getting out the vote. The key places for the PCs are to win in the 905, the belt around Toronto, in cities especially like Mississauga, but also to get that majority, the PCs have got to win in Toronto proper. You know, they have not won a seat in Toronto in a general election since 1999, and coincidentally or not, those 4 elections the PCs lost. So is this their opportunity to break that streak of 4 consecutive losses? That's exactly what they're hoping is going to happen tonight. We'll find out more in a few hours. Vassy?
Thanks, Mike. We're heading to Hamilton now, the convention center there, where the CBC's Chris Glover is with the NDP. Hey, Chris, anticipation must be pretty high there. How are Andrea Horwath's spirits doing today?
Yeah, you bet. Spirits are high for the NDP leader. She went around and toured some of her campaign headquarters in Toronto, and then she was here in Hamilton later this afternoon. And she is certainly bounding around those campaign headquarters. She even brought sweets to some of them, saying that it had been a sweet campaign. That's something that she had said a few times. They are seeing levels of support that they have not seen in a couple of decades. So they're definitely trying to put a positive spin on today. But as you just heard from Mike Crawley there, the PCs obviously also confident. So there is that stalling that we saw in the public opinion polls up to just a couple days ago for the NDP support. So definitely, as I've been working the room, talking to some of the NDP supporters, volunteers, and staffers tonight, there's a little bit of nervousness that you can imagine comes with most elections, but they are all eager to see what happens in this historic vote tonight, Vassy.
Thanks so much, Chris. Okay, let's head back to Toronto. Because that's where Lisa Shing is. She's, of course, at the Liberal headquarters there. A very interesting night, perhaps, ahead of the crew at that location. Of course, lots of historic predictions going on, saying that the Liberals could even be reduced to 1-2 seats. They need 8 in order to retain official party status. It's been quite a campaign. Unfortunately, I think we're having some technical difficulties, so we'll head back to the Liberal headquarters to check in with Lisa in a bit and gauge the mood there. It should be an interesting night for the Liberals. Ontario PC leader Doug Ford began this campaign with a commanding lead. Polls suggest now that NDP leader Andrea Horwath is nipping at his heels, and the Liberals are trailing well behind, as we just mentioned. So what happened? Joining me from Ottawa, as they have been throughout the campaign, our political commentator, Rob Silver, who we have to disclose is married to the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, and Denise Ciele, who is a partner at Hill Solutions Public Affairs. And about to join me in Toronto, she's just walking onto this set, is of course former NDP MP, now distinguished visiting professor at Ryerson University, Olivia Chow. Hi everyone, it's great to see you. Great to see you in person, Olivia, and nice to see both of you back in the studio in Ottawa. So before we begin, and I start asking questions, we put together a little tape of the highs and lows of this campaign, and I'll play that first, and then I'll get your reaction.
We've got a conservative leader who is, yes, I understand leading in the polls, but I also understand that he's bringing a message that would take us backwards.
With Kathleen, I think she got into politics for the right reason, but I truly believe she's lost her way.
It doesn't have to be a choice between Kathleen Wynne and Doug Ford, between bad and worse.
Did you know about the backroom deal about doubling his compensation?
Doug, are you talking to me about backroom deals? You're talking about you and the developers in the back room about the green belt?
And well, these two our hydro bills are going through the roof while these two argue that.
I'm not under any illusion that this is not a challenging election for us.
People feel like there's something exciting that can happen in our province, that we don't have to settle.
If you thought the Liberals were bad, an NDP government would be 10 times worse.
I don't know who voters will choose. That is up to them. But I'm pretty sure that it won't be me.
Many of you will vote to turn the page on 15 years of Liberal scandals. So the only question that remains is what kind of change you will vote for.
They should vote for the NDP because we're the only party that's prepared and ready and poised to stop Doug Ford.
Okay, out of that, I'm going to ask each of you the same question, and I know we know who everyone's cheering for, but if you were to objectively look at the campaign for the NDP, Olivia, what was the high point, what was the low point?
I think the high point is the first debate where Andrea connected with people. She was telling people that she gets it, how life is really not affordable, and then she offered a real sense of hope that, it can be affordable if we invest in health care, if we give dental care that is free, so life is not so expensive. I think that's the high point, and she always has a smile on her face, which is great. It feels like, okay, we can trust this person, It's a hopeful person.
And the low point?
The low point is some of the candidates, even though it's just a Facebook posting, some people make a big deal out of it, and I think that hurts a bit of the momentum, even though I know one of the candidates was an incredible interfaith leader.
But you're referencing some of the comments that were made on Facebook posts that came out, just for people who might not be as familiar.
There were several of them.
Quoting Hitler, one of them. Yeah.
That's right, and she said she didn't put it up, and then, God, who knows how it got posted. I think that didn't help. I think it hurt a little bit. But overall, I think NDP ran a classic campaign of connecting with people, contrasting 15 years, and Doug Ford wants to cut, and then propose, this is what we want.
Okay, Rob, over to you. The highs and lows of the Liberal campaign from your perspective? Or the high and low?
The high, I'd say, was the last debate performance by Kathleen Wynne. Today, I'm going to shock some people. Today may not be a great day for the Ontario Liberal Party. But But I think that in terms of her legacy from the last 4 years, which is obviously as of today, and people are voting, and I hate doing the partisan stuff while people are still voting. It's up to them. It's not up to us to tell them who to vote at this moment. But yeah, here we are doing the show. But it's fair to say she is not very popular with Ontarians right now, but she does have some things to be proud of. And I think that the history books 5, 10, 20 years from now are going to be a lot kinder to Kathleen Wynne than voters are likely to be tonight. In terms of what the lows of the campaign are, it's hard to pick one, Vassy. I'm sure
at least you're honest.
I'm sure we'll be talking about this tomorrow in terms of what went wrong and why things happened. There were positive things about what they did, but this is all happening for the reason because the voters are never wrong, and ultimately the voters are going to pass judgment on Kathleen Wynne and the Liberal Party tonight, and we'll see what it looks like.
All right, Denise, what about you? What do you think the high and the low of the Conservative campaign were?
Well, no surprise to anyone that this has been a tumultuous 4.5 months for the Progressive Conservative Party. So the highs were that they were able, in very short order, to release a leader, hold a credible leadership debate, and have a candidate in the form of Doug Ford, who was able to go out once the writ was dropped and share a message with the people of Ontario. And I think just in terms of looking at the polls from the time that he took over to now, I think just given the fact that he had such a short runway to present himself and present a very different vision. In fact, we'll remember from what Patrick Brown, the previous leader, had been putting forward. So I think that's a great high, and the Conservative, the PCs should be very proud of that. The lows have been certainly some distractions around candidate components, and it's happened with every single party. So we've seen that with the NDP, we've seen that with Liberals, we've seen that with the Tories as well. And just the last 3 or 4 days, having to go a little bit off message in terms of defending some of the lawsuit pieces has been difficult. But I think there's been a pivot that all parties have done around, okay, now it's time to get out the vote. Let's encourage our supporters to really cast the ballots in support of our party. And really, all said, I would say that all three party leaders have been tenacious, they've been dogged, and have been really pushing it to the very last day.
So, Olivia, we've often said in this panel about how the idea of change is perhaps the big ballot box question. But what do you think is the sort of preeminent thing in voters' minds? Like, what are they wrestling with as they head to the ballot box day? Because I know there are lots of decideds, but we've also talked about how many undecided people there were.
Trust. Who do they trust? And because if you want change, it's going forward. It's about future. It's not, holding back. It's not going backward, right? Anytime that you're going forward, when you change something, it's a leap of faith. So you need to trust someone in order to actually go and do it, right? And that's what change is about. So in many ways, Andrea's message of change for the better, let's invest and let's move forward, make life better, is a very good message. So, but trust, who do you trust most? Do you trust Kathleen Wynne or Andrea Horwath, or do you trust Doug Ford? I think that's the secondary, more subtle. Who do you trust to make sure your kids have a better future? Who do you trust to invest in childcare and healthcare and all those things that we really need in life, right? Who do you trust to manage money? So those are the valid question, I think. Who do you trust?
Rob, would you agree? Do you think that question of trust is high on the list for voters right now?
To some extent, there's a few different Ontarios going on, right? In some parts of urban Ontario, the economy is booming. People are doing, for the most part, not all people, but people are doing really well. There are other parts of the province that are really struggling. So it's hard. It's a big, complex, multifaceted province. And it's hard, therefore, to synthesize this into just one question. If you live in Northern Ontario, if you live in parts of Southwestern Ontario, things may be tough for you right now in a way that if you are working on Bay Street in downtown Toronto, they may not be. So I don't think there's just one question. It's a big province. It started as a change election. That ballot question in many ways quickly got discarded because it was very clear there was going to be change. So I do agree to some extent that it was a choice of two very different visions of change. But we'll see what the results are. If it's as the pollsters, as Eric Grenier's aggregator suggests with the Conservatives, it'll be interesting how much different their actual vote total is from what Tim Hudak got, what John Tory got, what Ernie Eves got. So there's going to be lots of punditry as of tonight and tomorrow of a massive change, of a populism wave, of is this Trump coming to Ontario. It's really possible that they just had a very efficient vote that was a core Conservative vote that was not very different from what previous Conservatives left, and Progressives just weren't willing to make the leap to an NDP government. If it's an NDP government, people were afraid of the change that Doug Ford was presenting, and there likely will be, if it's an NDP win tonight, a wave that's come across. Turnout's going to be high, and they're going to win seats nobody ever thought the NDP were going to win. I have no idea what's going to happen.
None of us do. Yeah, Denise, what about you? What do you think sort of going through those undecided voters' minds today as they head towards their polling station?
I think that this election has largely been characterized by the leadership personalities. So it's Kathleen Wynne, it's Andrea Horwath, and it's Doug Ford. But as voters are going to the polls, and I've talked to a few folks across Eastern Ontario in various ridings, and it's the sum of all its parts. It's who are those candidates that are very particularly speaking to the issues that are so important. And this is where I think actually the Progressive Conservatives have an edge, because the message has been very consistent across the province, whether it was Northern Ontario, Southwestern Ontario, 905 GTA. And there's an optimism there from very many PC candidates. I will say this, though, that when it comes to voting day, when someone gets to the polls, there might be an input that they see, whether it's a poll. There's a poll that came out last night that said, you know, the PCs are ahead. Does that motivate someone to tick a particular box? We don't know. But what I'm completely convinced of is it doesn't end until 9 p.m. And so right now we have every single party is working the phones. There are people door knocking, making sure that they can get their vote out. And for me, I have to give the edge to the Progressive Conservatives in terms of being able to get that vote out in a very particular way.
Okay, we've got to go. Thanks very much to Rob Silver, Denise Ciele, and Olivia Chow. But we will be checking in with all three of you a bit later in the show. Earlier, we heard from Mike Crawley and Chris Glover at the PC and NDP headquarters. We're going to check in now with the CBC's Lisa Shing at the York Mills Gallery with the Liberal Party. Hey, Lisa, thanks for being with us. What are you expecting there tonight?
Well, Vassy, needless to say, the mood here is a little bit subdued right now. Not defeatist by any means, but definitely not that celebratory atmosphere. Really, it's a bit of an unusual situation because Kathleen Wynne has conceded already. So I'll be looking for how many candidates, Liberal candidates, actually get voted into Queen's Park. Really, that's the message that Kathleen Wynne has been trying to send to voters is, while the Premier might not be her, that she wants as many Liberal candidates as to Queen's Park as possible to keep a possible NDP or PC government in check. So I'll be watching for that, whether Wynne keeps her seat, and also to see if the Liberals can get 8 seats in the legislature to keep official party status. Meanwhile, I've been speaking with supporters and volunteers here who are getting ready, and they say, you know, it's not over until it's over. They're going to keep their energy up. The volunteers are going to continue knocking on doors until the polls close to try and get that vote out, and they're not giving up until 9 o'clock.
All right, thanks so much, Lisa. We'll check back in with Lisa, Chris, and Mike in the next hour. You're watching a special extended edition of Power and Politics. We're here in Toronto to cover the Ontario election, but we're also tracking two major political stories elsewhere in the country. Up next, we'll show you the scene in Charlevoix, Quebec, where global leaders have begun arriving for the G7 summit, and the Senate is about to vote on the government's cannabis bill. Could tonight be a make-or-break moment for this key piece of legislation? We'll bring you an update from the Red Chamber right after this.
Are you going to go out and try it?
I have not yet in my life done so, which is unusual perhaps for my age cohort, but that happens to be the truth. I'm not in a rush. I can cope.
We will also obviously have some very robust discussions on trade. I think there are questions about what is going to be the dynamic at around the G7 table, and I can say that it'll be very similar to other G7 tables in which we highlight and discuss many things we're agreed on and have differences of opinion on other things.
World leaders are beginning to arrive for tomorrow's G7 summit in Quebec's Charlevoix region. The leaders are supposed to address 5 key themes, including climate change and preparing workers for the jobs of the future. But concerns about trade with the United States could take top billing. So how much will tariffs dominate the discussion? The CBC's David Cochran joins us from Quebec City now. Hey, David, thanks for being with us this morning. Prime Minister Trudeau and French President Emmanuel Macron talked about U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum. How do the leaders plan to approach President Trump about that?
Yeah, Vassy, it's going to be a pretty familiar message, and one we really started talking about a week ago when I was in Whistler for the G7 finance ministers meeting. And it's going to be a message to the U.S. president that his tariffs hurt everyone, not just the Canadians and the Europeans and the Mexicans that he's slapping these on, but it will also destroy jobs in the United States as well. So it's going to be a continuation of that message. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, we're told, will continue with what he's calling his polite but firm message. He's not going to back down, but he's also not going to escalate things. There will be no threat, for example, to burn down the White House a second time, plan, which is something they've been talking about. And Macron said pretty much the same thing, that it's going to be the G6 more or less united on tariffs, but they're also going to try to support Trump on a couple of things like North Korea, which is a very important initiative for the U.S. president right now, and use that to demonstrate to Trump that, look, if we work together in forums like this, you can get our backing, you can get our support on things like North Korea, but if you keep blindsiding us things like protectionist tariffs, it makes it that much harder for this forum to work together. So we're fairly certain that that will be the core message from Canada, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Japan is a little bit less certain because we saw Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, meeting with the U.S. President today, saying they're in full alignment on North Korea. Japan is seeking its own trade arrangement with the U.S. It needs the U.S.'s support on the North Korean security threat, which is just right across the sea from Japan. So it's uncertain whether Japan will be as firm. And then there's the wild card of the new Italian Prime Minister Conte, who's I have milk in my fridge older than this Italian government. They were sworn in 5 days ago. It's his first G7. He represents a coalition of populist and right-wing parties in Italy, so we don't quite know where that is going to go. But the message, to back up what France is going to say, Emmanuel Macron tweeted this a little while ago, saying, the American president may not mind being isolated, but neither do we mind signing a 6-country agreement if need be, because these 6 countries represent values. They represent an economic market which has the weight of history behind it and which is now a true international force. So to simplify the message to the United States is that if it's going to be America first, on a lot of things, Vassy, it's going to be America alone.
Wow, very pointed message. Are we sure that Donald Trump will even come? I mean, there's a Washington Post story that quotes American sources who say that he might skip the meeting to focus on North Korea.
Yeah, we have asked Canadian officials about this and summit officials about this. They kind of shrugged their shoulders because it is Donald Trump, but as of right now, they have every indication that he is going to come. Trump has made threats publicly before and not delivered on them, steel and aluminum tariffs being the exception, but the expectation right now in Quebec is that Donald Trump is coming here tomorrow.
Okay, thanks a lot, David. The CBC's David Cochran in Quebec City.
We have certainly scrutinized it exhaustively from end to end and top to bottom, but one can never be sure about these things. This is the way democracy works.
The immediate future for me is to ensure that Indigenous youth in particular, but all recreational users would not continue to be prosecuted.
I have a hard time with people who say, trust me, we'll make it work. I've been in sales all my life and I've used that line, but you got to be careful that when you say, trust me, I'll make it work, you better make sure it works.
It's been 6 months of intense debate, and now it comes down to these last few hours. Senators will vote on the government's landmark legislation to legalize the recreational use of weed. The Chamber of Sober Second Thought has passed 46 amendments, which makes for a lot of changes to the government's original bill. If it's passed, then the amended legislation heads back to the House of Commons for final approval. So, will the bill to make marijuana legal pass, and when will senators finish voting? Joining me from the foyer of the Senate, I believe, or the House of Commons, I'm not sure, is the CBC's Catherine Cullen. Hey, Catherine.
Hey, Vassy.
What's happening?
Yeah, I'm over here just outside the Senate doors, and these are the last, as you say, final hours of passionate debate. We've been hearing for senators for hours now. They are going to be voting at some point tonight. We still don't know when. The Senate is set to go until midnight if need be. Everybody has agreed that today is the day that quote-unquote final vote is happening because, of course, this gets sent back to the House of Commons. It'll come back to the Senate, so we're not really at the end of the road yet. But there have been a litany of topics raised, everything from the effects of marijuana on Indigenous communities to the rules around marketing, how the regulation process is going to work, what the impact on youth is going to be, addictions. Every senator in there has the opportunity to stand up and speak for 10 minutes on whatever it is they would like to say about this piece of legislation. And it is clear that there are a lot of passions in that room. Interestingly, there are a couple of new faces today, something that is attracting some attention. The Prime Minister named 2 new senators yesterday. They were sworn in at the beginning of the day today, and they're going to get the opportunity, if they so choose, to vote later on tonight. And that has some conservative senators suggesting that the Prime Minister is trying to stack the deck. They believe that those new senators are going to vote in favor of this legislation. The Prime Minister's office says that's not how it works. They've just been trying to fill Senate vacancies as quickly as possible.
And Catherine, I understand 2 conservative senators have abstained from voting on this. Why is that?
That's right, because they have financial interest in it. Linda Frum and Nicole Eaton both say that they cannot weigh in. They've decided that they're not doing that because they both stand to profit from legalization. That's interesting when you consider how vehemently opposed many conservative senators are to legalization.
And bottom line, what do we know about when legalization might actually kick in? Because I have a feeling a lot of people watching are wondering about that most of all.
It really is the big question, and I'm sorry to say that I still don't have that answer. Presuming the vote passes tonight, most people think that it will. It's back over to the House of Commons. We don't know how long it'll be there. Presumably it comes back to the Senate. Presumably that's the end of the debate. But you and I know, Vassy, the Senate is unpredictable. And even once all of that is over, the government has said it's going to put in a buffer zone, right, until legalization actually kicks in, something like 8 to 12 weeks to give the provinces time to get ready. So the clock is ticking, but what that final deadline is, we still have to watch and wait and see. And I will be here watching. Vassy?
Long night for you ahead. Thanks,
Indeed.
Catherine. The CBC's
You're welcome.
Catherine Cullen outside the Senate this evening. We're broadcasting today from Toronto as Ontario votes. The polls have seen some volatile shifts in this campaign. What could be the deciding factor tonight? CBC Polls analyst Eric Grenier is here. Well, here right now, but also after this commercial break.
Feeling really great. Beautiful day to change Ontario.
There's some knowns and some unknowns today, and I'm looking forward to what the people of Ontario decide. It's going to be an exciting night.
Yes, I'm always nervous. You can't ever, take people for granted.
Welcome back to a special edition of Power in Politics live from Toronto. Ontario votes today, and we're in the province's capital to set up what is expected to be a dramatic night. The hard-fought contest in Canada's largest province has been a closer race than many expected, with some dramatic twists and turns. So what should we be watching for tonight? Joining me right now is CBC's polls analyst, Eric Grenier. Hey, Eric, thanks for being with me. Appreciate it. What is the path to victory for the PCs tonight?
Well, it's the path that they've been working on throughout this campaign and what they had at the beginning of it. It was adding those rural seats that they've won in election after election, 2 seats in the GTA and in Toronto. Doug Ford always said that he would be able to deliver this city. We'll see if he actually does that tonight. That's the path for them to make sure that they win those seats where the Liberal vote is going to be dropping a lot, and that's probably where they have their best shot. In the last election, the Liberals more or less won almost all the seats in the GTA. It's just a sea of red. If it's a sea of blue tonight, that'll be a PC majority government.
Yeah. Okay. What has to happen for the NDP then to pull off an upset?
It again comes down to this part of the province, because for the New Democrats, they can do well in Southwest. The polling's been pretty good for them there. They can do pretty good in Northern Ontario. Maybe they can pull off some upsets in Ottawa. But if they aren't able to move into the Bramptons, the Mississauga ridings, Scarborough, if they don't win those seats, the ones that they might win in downtown Toronto, riding like here, won't be enough. So they really need to make sure that they can block Doug Ford's progression into the suburbs of Toronto. That has been the key for PCs, Conservatives, and other elections. The New Democrats just need to stop that.
What about undecided voters? And I know you have the actual numbers of them. I feel like anecdotally, I feel like it's such a huge chunk of people. A lot of my friends, I don't have a lot of friends, but most of them were very unsure until these last few days. How much of a factor are they going to be in this?
Well, the polls, depended on the polls from the last week, maybe around 10% have said that they were undecided or not leaning towards a party.
So my friends are freaks. They're in the minority. No, I'm kidding.
Well, the thing is,
minority, yeah, no.
It's not clear how committed a lot of other voters were, because you still had about 70%, 75% of voters who said they were going to vote for one party or another, saying that they were locked in. So you're still looking at people who said, I'm probably going to vote PC or NDP or Liberal, but a quarter of them were still more or less open to changing their mind. So that could be a big factor, and we have seen that the race still is relatively close between the PCs and the New Democrats, depending on where those people come out. If we see that those Liberals, if those Liberals come out in places where the New Democrats are favored, but they decide not to vote for the Liberal Party. Because if they heard Kathleen Wynne make that announcement that she said she was not going to win, how many Liberals are still going to vote for the party? Are they going to stick with the Liberals, go to another one? That can be a big factor as well.
Actually, it was funny because this morning I talked to somebody, for the first person of everyone who had thought about voting Liberal, who said, I'm now going to vote Liberal because Kathleen wins out, which I thought I hadn't heard anyone else say that. Anyway, speaking of the Liberals, what is going to happen to them? I always, whenever you have your seat projections, that is the most fascinating one to me, because it's always like 1 to 11 or 15. Are they going to be able to preserve their official party status?
That is the good night for them, if they can manage that. So if they can win 8 seats or more, that would be keeping that official party status, and it would be historically their worst result ever if they don't. They've never had less than that many seats in the legislature, going back to Confederation. So for the Liberals, that is really the key for them. Are they going to be able to do it in Toronto, in Ottawa? These are the areas that I'll be keeping an eye on to see if there'll be those little spots of red, maybe a couple around the Thunder Bays.
Right.
If they can do that, then they can retain it, but it's not going to be easy. And if the Liberals are doing that, if they're keeping those at least 8 seats, that's probably not going to be good news for the New Democrats, because they need those Liberal seats, they need those Liberal votes.
Interesting. Okay, thanks a lot, Eric. Appreciate it. CBC's Eric Grenier. Eric and his very trusty calculator will be part of the Ontario Votes election special beginning at 8 o'clock Eastern Time tonight. I'll be there too. Join Dwight Drummond and Rosemary Barton after this extended edition of Power and Politics. Now, Ontario makes up nearly half of the country's total economy, so no matter how the province votes today, the results will be felt across the country. The Power Panel will discuss that and a lot more. Amanda, Althea, Chad, and Kathleen are all here with me in Toronto right after this. Welcome back to a special edition of Power in Politics live from Toronto. It's Election Day in Ontario, and most polling stations will close just over 3 hours from now, bringing to an end a tumultuous campaign for all three parties. It's an election that will have ripple effects across the country. So just how unusual was this campaign, and what lessons will politicians take from tonight's outcome? It's time for the Power Panel. Joining me now, Amanda Alvaro with Pomp and Circumstance, Chad Rogers of Crestview Strategy, Kathleen Monk with Earnscliffe, and Althea Raj of HuffPost Canada. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you in one place. It's very exciting. Okay, Kathleen, I'm going to start with you since you're right next to me. How crazy, stack it up. You've worked on so many campaigns. How crazy has this one been?
It's so exciting. Well, first of all, it's Election Day, so it's really exciting for a number of reasons, because you actually get to door knock.
Nerds, yeah.
And we're all nerds, you know, and we all get to stay up really late. We all probably woke up really early, but it is an exciting election. You know, there's been 15 years of the same government in this province. A lot of scandal, some corruption. People were looking for change, and I think that hopefully tonight it will deliver. You know, I'm cautiously optimistic. I know, though, at the very base level, that New Democrats have run an excellent, I would say almost flawless campaign. Andrea Horwath has been really strong in connecting with Ontarians. And I mean, a few weeks ago, I was on this panel with Althea and others, and I was told by my fellow pundits, you know, no way, they don't even know her name, she's going nowhere.
No way, they just were laughing at drinking because you said Andrea Horwath's name so many times.
And here we are, you know, and at the very minimum tonight, we're gonna see her become the leader of the official opposition. I guarantee you she will double her seat count and maybe even take government.
So, Amanda, would you have predicted that we would be having this discussion, you know, a month ago?
Well, we may be where we are today because Kathleen said her name so many times. It's been an extraordinary campaign. Is this my happiest day? No, it's not. It's a really tough day for Liberals, but it's not an unexpected day. If you've been watching the polls and haven't been living under a rock, then you knew that this was the likely outcome, despite the fact that Kathleen had a pretty good campaign. I mean, she's a pretty formidable speaker. She did great in the debates. She put forward an important platform, a costed platform, all of the things that you're supposed to do. But heading into it, she hadn't connected with voters. She saw a downward trajectory in her popularity numbers over the last year in particular. So none of that changed. They just weren't able to turn the tides on that campaign. I think really the big news out of this campaign, despite who's going to win, is the fact that the NDP were able to close that gap. The PCs started out with a 20-point lead. The gap is virtually non-existent. So it has been, to their credit, a great campaign. But a win is a win. And a loss is still a loss. So for all of the great language that we can put around how happy they'll be, they're not going to be truly happy unless they take a minority, and that's looking really unlikely at this point.
Althea, do you think the story of this campaign is the NDP, basically, and their rise?
Sorry, I'm swinging
no,
in
I
the seat. I'm having audio issues. Pardon me. What is the story of the campaign?
Well, do you agree that the NDP's rise is essentially the story of the campaign, or do you think otherwise?
Well, I mean, we don't really yet know what the story of the campaign is because
we don't know how the story ends,
what's going to happen. And so maybe the polls are wrong. Who knows? It's happened before, south of the border, prime example. I think that there are some important things that did happen in this campaign. I think Andrea Horwath positioned herself quite well as the voice of progressives. And Kathleen Wynne decided to really run a campaign that was, if you want to vote for the left, vote for us. And Andrea Horwath rightly said, no, if you want choice and you want a progressive campaign, then we are that choice for you. I think, something that can't really be understated is the fact that the Conservatives, PCs, this implosion of the party just a few months ago to rise from the ashes, to go through so many. A normal campaign, you would think that they would have suffered. All of these candidate scandals doesn't seem to faze them. They released a platform that wasn't costed, doesn't seem to faze them. So many things that we assumed were norms have been destroyed by this campaign.
But they lost 20 points.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
it wasn't like, I mean, they started off
strong. But we don't know yet how the story ends.
Yeah, we don't know.
In our polls.
Let's bring in Chad, because at the first half of that answer, you were shaking your head and then you started nodding your head. So.
Well, I would just say, according to my fellow panelists, the story of this Olympics is the silver and bronze medalists. Look, here's what's happened. Kathleen Wynne drove the economic engine of Canada into a permanent stall, and Ontarians are going to punish her for that tonight and punish her party historically with the biggest loss they will have suffered in a century. Why? Because all of us will be dead and fully decomposed before we even start to address the debt she accrued while she was premier.
Image, yeah.
Second piece, Andrea Horwath. Andrea Horwath's going to have a great showing tonight. But let's remember, in an election that is a historic defeat for Liberals, the best opportunity the NDP are going to have to win in modern memory, she still couldn't do it.
Well, we don't
so tonight
know
is going to be her top.
Sure,
I'm going to predict that the
for
26th Premier of Ontario tonight is going to be Doug Ford.
We don't know
and
for
Doug,
sure.
I predict when Doug Ford wins tonight, it's going to be a two-part plan. It's going to be we have to stop the spending. We have to stem the bleeding. We have to close the wound. But we also have to kickstart the Ontario economy. And I think you're going to see a new Conservative cabinet in the next 2 weeks come forward, and that will be their laser vision. We have to restart the Ontario economy.
Will he reveal actually how that spending will be cut?
Look, if you're Doug Ford, you had two platforms, really. You had the first platform, and then you had the one you had to innovate in a leadership when you had to build a campaign in 90 days, and for the first time ever, not only be party leader, but stand up and be ready to be premier. What Doug did is said, I won't take a growth assumption. I won't say I know the size of the Ontario economy because we don't know the size of the debt.
He actually,
because the spending
never said
right
it,
now,
or never said that that articulately.
Confederation to 2003, Ontario accrues $130 billion in debt. Today, when Kathleen Wynne leaves, it's $330 billion. She put $200 billion on with her colleague Dalton McGuinty. It's a historical anomaly. It's insane, and she's going to be punished for it.
This side of the bench wants to weigh in. I can see.
I'd say a couple things. I respect my colleague Chad very much, but what he's choosing to ignore is a number of things. This scandal has been rocked with criminal investigations into the candidate that his party represents, the 407 data breach, other scandals. On top of that, we have somebody who has squandered a 20-point lead and whose negatives for Doug Ford have just skyrocketed. And in terms of, Chad tries to project the idea that Ford will somehow rein in the economy. We don't even know his plan. We have yet to see a fully costed platform. So where are the new revenue measures? I know where the NDPs are. New Democrats will actually look at taxing people a little bit more to pay for the services that we know Ontarians want. We have no idea what he's going to do except cut $6 billion across the board, 4% cut in every department. That means goodbye hospitals, goodbye schools, firing nurses. That is what a 4% across the board cut looks like.
To Althea's point, though, it seems, if the polls are correct, that didn't rattle a lot of people. Like,
we don't know that. We do not know.
You're right, but it didn't seem like it sunk them.
Right now is that virtually, in terms of the public opinion polls, and we all have our internal polling numbers as well.
Except for me,
what
are your internal polling numbers, Althea?
that we have essentially a neck and neck race, right? But what I can tell you about the data points that I know right now, I know that New Democrats have run more full campaigns in more diverse regions of the country than has ever been run in terms of this party in this province. We are going to be picking up seats in the north, in the southwest, in the 416, and the wider GTHA. We might even make some gains in the east, which traditionally has been a bit of a desert for New Democrats. And we can look at real gains like Ottawa Centre, potentially Ottawa West Nepean, and even Vanier. So I think people were looking for hope. They were looking for change. And when presented with a choice of change, you could have Doug Ford, you could have Andrea Horwath. The campaign lined up to being, we want change.
Amanda,
that's different.
is the ballot question, though, as much about change as it was in the beginning of the campaign, given that Kathleen Wynne has already conceded?
Yeah, I still think it is. I still think it has always been about change for people, and what that change looks like has maybe evolved a little bit over the course of the campaign. I came in, this party came in 2003 on a different wave of change. So certainly change elections are driven by that kind of momentum, and very rarely does it turn back, does the tide turn back. So I think that we're still there. I think the GTA, you mentioned, I think it's going to be the teller of the night tonight. I think that 47 of 124 ridings are there. It's what propelled Kathleen Wynne into a majority government last time around. Those seats are going to matter. Turnout is really going to matter. There's been a lot of predictions around advanced polling, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the get out the vote strategy tonight is going to be a huge shore of brand new voters. And what the NDP needs is a lot of new voters.
What's the war room like right now, Chad?
Well, I think war rooms shut down on Election Day. War rooms get boring on Election Day because everybody has to go pull vote. I went out, I don't do campaigns anymore, but a friend of mine was running. I won't say who or where, but I jumped in the car today and went out and knocked on doors. I knocked on doors and put literature on doors and talked to voters. Most of them had already gone out to vote. Early voting's clearly become normal behavior. I would just say it's Pride Month here in Toronto, and I'm going to take the parlance of my people. The theme of this election is Bye Felicia. This was the election where Ontarians said goodbye to Kathleen Wynne forever.
That storyline is over. It's dead. It's over.
The other story tonight is going to be a mandate for a new government. And for all of the scorekeeping and other people trying to say what the competing narratives are, Doug Ford is the physical embodiment of change and outsider.
That is
so
so
have an outsider
terrifying.
premier, and he is going to stop the bleeding and kickstart the economy. That is the story tonight.
Althea, what do you make of that idea? I mean, we've talked about that idea of the outsider because it's so prevalent in the United States, and that sort of, there is a resonance among people of that idea. Like, we don't want the same old type of politician. Do you think it resonates the same way here as it did south of the border?
I don't know that I think that's what he started off saying, and that's obviously something that the party members embraced when he won the party's leadership. But you saw when the poll numbers started tanking and he had to surround himself with a team, is the team that helped him rise up according to public opinion polls. Having Christine Elliott and Caroline Mulroney and Rob Phillips and all these people that seem to give him, like, maybe you don't like Doug Ford, or you're worried about Doug Ford because you think he might be a bit like Donald Trump. Well, here are some other people that are maybe more traditionally PC that you could feel a bit more trust and some relief at having around the cabinet table. So I think that's kind of what we saw.
Doug Ford's not an old school politician. He's brand new to this. He's brand new to being a leader. He's had 90 days to learn how to be.
Well, he was a lot of Torontonians as a city councillor. Yeah.
It's an awfully big task to ask anybody to stage up from nowhere in early March to be ready to be premier tomorrow morning.
He was
He
volunteered.
This is an
What's going to be
astounding.
interesting? I mean, now he's just making stuff up. But I think what's going to be interesting, like for viewers at home, and people can still be voting right now, so we should be careful. We encourage people to get out to vote and go. And in some places like Grassy Narrows, people can even vote later because that particular poll opened late. So check your polling in terms of when it's open till, and please go and vote. I pulled one vote in terms of the taxi cab driver I was taking on the way here. I was like, you've got to vote. And he's going out to vote in Richmond Hill. But I think what we want to look at post this election is, yes, exactly what Amanda said. What was turnout? We had around 51% in 2014. It's been much lower in the past. The last kind of kick the bums out election was actually 1990 when Bob Rae won. And the turnout there was more like 68%. Will we see something like that?
Or 95 when they kicked Bob Rae out.
Yeah, But in terms of the turnout, the highest was actually beyond 71. Like it was 1990 at around 68%. Will we see higher turnout? What is the gender divide going to be like tonight? We know for sure in terms of our internals, and we're seeing it publicly, that women don't like Doug Ford. They see how he's treating his own family in terms of his sister-in-law, in terms of Renata Ford. And they're saying, whoa, what's going to happen? How will he treat my family? And that's a real concern. And so looking at those numbers in a post-election context will be really interesting.
Chad, I'll let you respond to that.
Well, I just say tonight there are a couple of other stories. We redrew electoral districts, so power's being redrawn in Ontario. We're adding 17 seats. Some of them are in places like Brampton, where the NDP are going to have a whole new coalition. We're going to possibly see a Green member. I think we're going to see a fresher, more diverse, slightly younger Queen's Park for the first time in 15 years. That's good. As I look towards the outcome tonight, this is one of those once in a generation, once every 3 or 4 elections historical moment for Ontario where we choose a path. Kathleen's party put forward a path that said more government can help you in a tough time. Doug Ford said kickstarting the economy is the priority. So tonight we get to see what people choose.
Amanda, let me ask you, on the federal scene, how concerned is the federal government right now about the possibility of Premier Ford tomorrow?
I mean,
and the loss of Premier Wynne.
Yeah, and I think what I'll say, given recent G7 concerns aside for a moment, and NAFTA concerns aside, the Prime Minister and his team and the administration has done a really good job of forging relationships with people who seem to be difficult to forge relationships with. So I think no matter who the Premier is, they will be, their whole desire has been consensus building, having the Premiers play a big role, making sure that everybody gets around the table. How open to that the new potential Premier may be is yet to be seen, but I think he'll wear that, not the Prime Minister.
No, tonight is
I've got to
Act
take
1
a quick break.
of the 2019
We've got lots more, though. Don't worry. We've got more Power Panel after this quick break. You're watching a special edition of Power and Politics on CBC News Network, also broadcasting on SiriusXM's Canada Talks channel. Stay with us. I'm Vassy Kapelos, live from Toronto with a special edition of Power in Politics, and we're here with the Power panel: Chad Rogers, Althea Raj, Amanda Alvaro, and Kathleen Monk. So let's pick up where we left off. Kathleen, I'll start with you. So tomorrow we wake up. What will we be presented with, and what does the next 24 hours, 48 hours, month look like?
Well, first of all, we wake up tomorrow morning, and
I
the
know what you're
children
gonna say,
behind
but
me are going to be so happy because they'll have a future in this province, that they'll have infrastructure builds, education.
They're
and
leaving. I don't know
strong-
what's on that sign
healthcare,
up, but yeah.
and more skate parks, possibly. That might be something we could work into the agenda. No, I mean, honestly, so every leader will hold some kind of a veil tomorrow, or certainly the New Democrats will hold in a veil. After their big parties tonight. And I think that, should New Democrats be successful, obviously they begin the machinations of the swear-in process in the weeks and months ahead. If they don't win government, they will have the second highest showing that this party has ever had. They will benefit incredibly for the change in terms of the resources that will flow into the party. They've done incredibly well in terms of fundraising. The most in this 2018 done much better than the Liberals in this fundraising sector. They're stronger. They're more powerful. And if they're not elected government, the great news is that Ontarians will have someone they can trust to stand up to Doug Ford.
Okay, for the Liberals, what does the tomorrow look like, and if everything goes the way it seems like it will, what does the rebuild sort of start?
We start off with a sad day.
Single tier,
Single tier. But you know what? Here's the thing about politics. It's like 1 minute you're in one place and the next minute you're heading into another. And there's not a lot of time to sit around and sulk about it. You've got to pick up the pieces. If everything goes the way that we assume it will go, then Ontarians will be handing us down a really decisive condemnation of this party. So the party has to take that, can't be arrogant about it, has to decide we have to be something new, we have to refresh, we have to rebuild, we probably have to take a much more centrist view, putting forward a different outlook to families, but it's not impossible. We were there in 2011 federally when we were reduced to third-party status. 4 years later, we won a majority government. Everything is possible. But the entire narrative for the Liberal Party of Ontario will be about rebuilding and starting afresh.
Althea, what are you watching for the day after?
Well, the day after, I guess, is going to be a culmination of what happened the night before, right? I mean, if there are any resignation, what the fallout of that is, and obviously we're all in a speculation game, so like, ooh, who will be the new leader of the Liberal Party? But I think what's probably more interesting from a federal standpoint is the response that this is going to generate back in Ottawa. When the NDP won in Alberta, when Rachel Notley won, the NDP caucus felt like they had new wind in their sails, and they were re-energized, and there was perhaps a fear amongst the Liberals federally that this dichotomy in the electorate was now more polarized than before, and if voters wanted to vote for a progressive voice, well, maybe the NDP was where they should park their ballot. So how that plays federally is going to be interesting to watch, and then what are the sort of threats, right? If Doug Ford wins a majority government, then what happens to the Liberals' carbon pricing plan, and how much of that is really going to be a handicap? Are there other things federally that the government wants to accomplish where they no longer have a key partner in Ontario? So that's going to be interesting.
What do you think, Chad?
Well, I'd say for Premier Designator or Premier-elect Doug Ford, tomorrow morning starts the biggest job he's ever had, where he enters transition, but transition with an austerity regime. He's going to have some very terrifying facts presented to him in the next 2 weeks and have to build a government from scratch. For the Liberal Party, a vicious bloodletting and a leadership that's probably going to take a year just to pay for. For the NDP, a discovery that becoming the next Tom Mulcair of Ontario may be a prize that has some cost attached to it. In reality, though, I think the biggest effect tomorrow is we've just started the first act of the next federal election, where the Prime Minister is going to get a great foil in Premier Ford, where the Liberal Party is going to have to decide, is its coalition changing? And Jagmeet Singh's getting a huge shot in the arm with probably a bigger coalition of provincial partners to help him, and a new Green. Which is going to get a lot of attention. A Canadian American. Maybe Mike Schreiner can help with NAFTA using both his passports. I don't know.
I do want to actually turn our attention to NAFTA and the federal scene because leaders are beginning to arrive in Charlevoix. A lot of stuff has gone down over the last 48 hours. Amanda, why don't I start with you? Do you? I mean, we're all wondering. The Washington Post is saying he doesn't. Mr. Trump doesn't want to come.
Oh, I know.
He thinks he needs to concentrate on North Korea. He thinks everyone's going to gang up.
Right.
And so how crazy is this? Like we were all thinking it could get wild. It seems like it is going to be wild.
I mean, yeah, and I read the Washington Post article, and you know what? Here's the fact of the matter is, he might not show up, but he probably will. He probably will because...
I'm actually just interrupt you for a second. I'm sorry, but that's British Prime Minister Theresa May coming down in Bagotville. She'll be heading, of course, to Charlevoix, where all the G7 leaders are arriving. They're kind of arriving one by one. She's going to be greeted, I believe, by Minister Duclos, Jean-Yves Duclos. There he is right there on the left side of your screen. And the UK High Commissioner, I believe, at some point will also be in that lineup, a little bit further down in the line. So anyway, as we'll pick up, we'll keep watching her arrival, but obviously one of the biggest, she's one of the 6 against the 1, right? And we saw some very powerful pointed words from Macron today as well. So how might that affect, Amanda, what we're going to see?
So again, like whether or not, what will Trump's stance be? Will he even walk in the door is what people are talking about today. And I think the only thing that would be worse for him than being ganged up on is being seen to have run away from something. So I suspect entirely that he'll be there, if not to bolster his showing, to show everybody that he's prepared to take on the fight, even when it's being coined the G6+1 or the G1+6. I imagine, like everyone does, that it's going to be fairly acrimonious. He knows what he's walking into. He knows that these are allies that are looking for consensus agreements, that he's kind of the isolated stalemate on a lot of these issues. So will he come to the table at all? His volatility and unpredictability makes it impossible for us to guess what the outcome will be.
What did you think, Kathleen, of, Macron's tweet today, and I don't have it verbatim, but essentially saying, like, we are more powerful together than you will be. A very antagonistic tone. I don't know. I can't even remember the last time I've seen anything like that towards the United States.
Yeah, Macron was very strong today, but also can you imagine Merkel or May being any less strong? Last week on your show, I said, I bet that he wasn't actually going to show up, and that was before the tariff war.
You still think he won't come?
I have my doubts, but what I'm clear about is that this is really going to be a test of Trudeau's leadership. How so? Can he get the 6 to still sign that communique? Will they continue to sign off on things like on gender, on climate? Will they rally around those things? Will this be a 6, +1 on the outside? I think those are the questions going in. And what, just from a purely, stagecraft, desire to see how it plays out, how will that family photo look on Friday? Like, will they stand together, or will it be like everybody plus Trump? I don't know. So I'm watching for that.
How combative do you think it's going to be, Althea?
Well, if he shows up, it will be pretty combative. I think that the Washington Post article is just some way of giving him cover in case he decides at the last minute not to show up, right? Like, he may not, because they don't actually know whether or not he's going to finally get on the plane. Angela Merkel on Wednesday, Mr. Macron today, basically said the exact same thing. We do not want to water down our commitments because the Americans don't want to get on board. So whether we're not all 7 signing the final communique and it's just a statement from the chair, the Prime Minister saying, well, the 6 of us have agreed to this, and one member, which we will not name, refuses to agree with the rest of us.
Yeah.
Maybe. We've seen that at the OECD just last month. They said, we all agree except for one nation, that multilateralism is super important. So I think that they are all committed. They view this as an opportunity actually to gang up on Donald Trump. But the Prime Minister spent the day on the phone with leaders of Italy, with Ms. May, actually. So they're obviously coordinating their approach, and we'll see if that helps them tomorrow.
Is that ganging up or coordination, Chad, going to work?
I think it's dramatically overstated in its importance. American moral leadership in the Western world is critical to the experiment working. The fact that President Trump has removed himself makes the G7 irrelevant. You will have 6 global leaders, none of whom's economies, militaries, or might match up collectively to the American regime. And I'm sad. I'm sad that this human stain continues to essentially challenge the order we built since World War II. But I think the G7 is little more than a petulant debating club absent American leadership right now, and all of their attempts to act. Macron is a bootlicker to Trump visiting one week and standing up on Twitter the next. It is meaningless, and it is enabling this man to continue to paralyze us. Will he or won't he arrive? Why are we talking about it? It's his negotiating tactic. He's treating this like another dumb condo deal.
But it's not the leaders who are enabling it. The media is writing the story. The leaders aren't writing that story.
I think we're all caught as sick hostages to a man who literally has paused the development.
So what do you? I think to be fair, Prime Minister Trudeau this week taking a more, a firmer stand, a less cordial stand. kind of understandable given what happened with the tariffs, right? Like, at what point do you just,
I've
what
admired
would
the
your advice
restraint
be?
from Prime Minister Trudeau up till now, because Prime Minister Trudeau being in conflict with Donald Trump is electoral catnip. His whole constituency wants him to do that. It feels good, it's easy, but it doesn't get us what we want in the world. And the fact that he's dropped that restraint because of a level of frustration and insult foisted by the U.S. president, I still think it's short-sighted and it's going to be damaging for our economy, and I'm sad it's come to this.
But what made you think that being nice was working?
Because we could be the ally that got away with it. Donald Trump can only tolerate one or two thoughts simultaneously, and you just don't want to be his target. And if he wants to break us up from the Mexicans, like I said on this broadcast a year and a half ago, Taco Tuesday is over if we have to separate and protect the largest economic and security relationship in the history of man. I feel very bad for our Mexican colleagues, but they are a political target of a bad person. The NAFTA renegotiation is unsubtle jingoism on the part of Donald Trump. Canada needs to back out of the room as silently as it can to protect tens of thousands of jobs.
Okay, I have to leave it there, unfortunately. But thank you very much to the Power Panel, Kathleen Monk, Amanda Alvaro, Althea Raj, and Chad Rogers. Demonstrators gathered outside the University of Alberta today to protest an honorary degree being given to scientist, environmentalist, and broadcaster David Suzuki. The group calls the recognition an insult to the school and to Alberta's oil and gas industry. About a dozen of Suzuki's supporters held a counter-demonstration. Suzuki has been a staunch critic of the oil sands and their impact on the environment. The university says the honorary Doctor of Science degree is for his leadership and accomplishments in science education. At the bottom right of your screen, you'll see we are counting down to when polls close in most of Ontario. 3 ridings in the province will see voting extended beyond 9 o'clock Eastern Time tonight. We've been following the Ontario provincial race for weeks now. Here's a refresher on what each party pitched to voters. Let's start with healthcare, where each party is promising big spending. The PCs say they'll add 15,000 new long-term beds and boost mental health funding by $1.9 billion. The NDP will spend $19 billion on new hospitals, 2,000 new beds, and 15,000 long-term spaces. The Liberals pledge $822 million for hospitals and $2.1 billion for mental health. On to education and childcare. Here, the PCs are promising to scrap the current sex ed and math curriculum. The NDP would create 200,000 new childcare spots, and the Liberals plan to make full-day daycare free for kids until they're old enough for kindergarten. On the environment, the PCs say they'll throw out the current cap-and-trade system and fight the federal carbon tax. The NDP will take a quarter of the revenue from the cap-and-trade system and help support rural, northern, and lower-income households. And the Liberals would direct $1.7 billion towards energy-saving projects. It's a long and expensive list of promises, so how will each party pay for them? The PCs say they'll find $5.6 billion in efficiencies in Ontario's current budget. The NDP will increase the corporate tax rate to 13%, and the Liberals will raise income taxes for the province's highest earners. But that still won't be enough to pay for it all. So the one thing the 3 parties have in common, they all plan to run deficits. The PCs would for the first 2 years with no specific plan to return to balance. The NDP would run deficits for at least the next 5 years, also with no specific date to balance the books. And the Liberals' deficits are forecast to run until 2024. Up next, we'll check in with each of our reporters stationed at the main party headquarters, and they've been here before, election night, with their fates in the hands of the electorate. We'll be joined by 3 former premiers for a special edition of the Premiers League. Stay with us. Welcome back to this special edition of Power in Politics. I'm Vassy Kapelos, and we are live from outside the CBC Broadcasting Centre in Toronto. It's decision day here in Ontario. In less than 3 hours, polls close in most parts of the province in what has been a very tight race between the PCs and the NDP. Liberal leader Kathleen Wynne conceded defeat just a few days ago, and now the party is trying to secure enough seats to hang on to official party status. The CBC's Lisa Shing is at the York Mills Gallery with the Liberal Party. Hey, Lisa, what are you hearing there from staff and volunteers?
Well, Vassy, the sense I get is that they're not going to give up until the very end. They're fighting this one out. Yesterday, I was on the campaign bus with the Liberals all day, and essentially the same tone there. Pretty energetic staff, as well as an energetic Wynne, Kathleen Wynne, trying to really rally support behind the Liberals, taking photos with staff and supporters, as well as her security team. The sense I got, though, and what was stark, was it almost in a way felt like a farewell tour. I spoke with some of the supporters on each of the stops, and they say they wanted to come out and thank Kathleen Wynne for her service and what she's done for the province over the last 5 years. So a bit of an undertone of sadness from these people. One woman also told me that when she heard the news that Kathleen Wynne had conceded, she actually cried, and then she cried again when she relayed the news to her husband. So I'm getting the sense that tonight it may be a bit of that same tone, depending on what the results are. But until anything can really happen at this point. But really, volunteers are still knocking on doors. They're going to be out there right up until the polls close, trying to get that vote out. So they're sticking to their guns on this one, Vassy.
All right, thanks a lot, Lisa. Let's turn now to Mike Crawley. He's at the Toronto Congress Centre with the PC party. Hey, Mike, if the PCs win tonight, what will be the key factors that determine whether they get a majority?
It's going to be about where they win, really. Look, I think I mentioned previously that the PCs have not won a seat in a general election in Toronto since 1999, 4 straight elections. So if they're going to win, they've got to make breakthroughs in the 416. Look, they're likely to win Doug Ford's seat in Etobicoke North, so they're pretty much guaranteed one. But they've really got to win elsewhere in Toronto, elsewhere in Etobicoke, in Scarborough, in North York. But the real key to victory is the 905, and that's where there does seem to be a significant amount of support. The PC strategists I've spoken to think that they can take just about every seat in York region, in Vaughan, Markham, in Aurora, Newmarket area kind of thing. So it's the geography of it, because until now, for several elections, the PCs have been predominantly winning in rural areas, and they haven't been able to make the breakthroughs in urban and suburban Ontario. So that's, I think, the key to it. Vassy?
Okay, thanks a lot, Mike. Let's move over to Chris Glover. He's at the Hamilton Convention Centre with the NDP. Hey, Chris, I know you've spoken with a lot of volunteers and supporters there. How are they feeling?
They're putting on a brave face, absolutely. They're definitely confident and optimistic about what might happen tonight. This is, for them, kind of a historic moment, because it's levels of support that they have not seen in public opinion polls for the NDP in a couple of decades that we have been seeing over the course of this election campaign. So they have a lot they tell me that they are already proud of, but definitely they're anxious for the vote tonight because they want to see if they can put it over the edge. And I was just talking with some of the campaign officials who say that they are expecting to fill this room tonight because they are certainly looking at either forming government or being the official opposition. They've not been the official opposition since the 70s or 80s, so it has been a long, long time for them even being in that role. So they definitely tell me that they have a lot to be proud of, and they are looking forward to seeing what those results are tonight. And as Mike was saying with the 416, the NDP are also hoping to do very well in the city of Toronto. In 2014, they only had 2 seats after that election in the city of Toronto, only 2 seats in the greater Toronto area. The NDP is hoping to do much better in both of those areas. Plus, speaking about the eastern part of the province, they didn't have a seat east of Oshawa. Well, they are hoping to make inroads in places like Peterborough and places where they have not been elected for a couple of decades, Vassy.
Interesting night ahead of us. Thanks, Chris. We'll check back in with Chris, Mike, and Lisa in the next hour. So emotions are running high at the major party headquarters, as we just heard. As the candidates await their political fate, how nerve-wracking is the waiting game, and what are the national repercussions of this election? We are swapping out pundits now for a straight-up view of this election by those who've led their parties and have served as premier. This is our election edition of the Premiers League. Joining me from Vancouver, former BC Premier Ujjal Dosanjh. In Saskatoon, former Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall, now Special Advisor at Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt LLP. And with me here on set, former Ontario Premier David Peterson, Chairman Emeritus and Senior Counsel at Castles Brock Lawyers. Hi to all three of you. Thank you so much for being with me. I appreciate it. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Peterson, and if you'll permit me to get personal, I might ask.
You can do whatever you want.
Thank you.
Let's invite these two guys to the Ontario election. It's nice to have some
I wish they were here as well. I'm going to start with you, though, and ask, tell me a bit of insight into what it's like to be in the shoes of Kathleen Wynne or Doug Ford or Andrea Horwath tonight.
Depending on whether you think you're going to win or lose, it's either wonderful or awful. And you're sitting with your family and usually very close advisors, and you're watching all this. And this race is when we don't know what's going to happen. And there's a lot riding on this. I mean, Kathleen has already declared her position, so she's resigned to this. And she's handled this, in my view, with a great deal of dignity. She recognized the inevitable, and she recognized that she was the problem. She felt that, so she didn't want to hold the party back. And who knows what the repercussions of that will be electorally. But the other two, they're both sitting there hopeful, and one of them's going to be disappointed tonight unless something strange happens, and it could well be
never know.
Some kind of a minority, some kind of a not clear situation. So we'll know, but it's hard on the nerves. But I'll tell you one thing about political leadership. Everybody carries hope. Everybody kind of thinks they're going to win even if they're not.
Interesting. Okay, Mr. Wall, actually I have a funny story for you, because the first night of my entire career was the day you won the election as Premier in Swift Current, Saskatchewan. So I remember it very clearly. Tell me what was going through your mind the night before.
Person's nervous. We had reasonable expectations of success for the next day. That would have been in early November of 2007. And the actual day, though, you wake up that day and there's a few orders of business to take care of. At least there was in our case. I wanted to check in with the campaign co-chairs and get a sense of what was going around the province in terms of our Get Out the Vote campaign, and just sort of check in with those who are in the field, so to speak, and get a report back. And I did that, but I eventually, when those calls were done, I eventually just started pacing. I was hopeful about it, but I was kind of getting nervous. And Tammy my wife was home from work that day, and I think I sufficiently annoyed her, because at one point she said, just go outside and water the lawn and do it by hand, which I did, actually. I really didn't know what else to do. So I literally was out there with the garden hose kind of watering the lawn, and then at the appropriate time we actually went and voted, of course, and the media are there and they want to see you vote. But it's a long day. You're obviously very anxious for the result. We were optimistic and hopeful, but I can tell you that the first few results that came in on the live television coverage, they weren't very hopeful for whatever reason. They weren't great polls. And at that point, I just left. I took our dog for a walk. By the time I came back, there were close friends and family there. And as I walked up the steps, a good friend of mine who I've known since grade 6 said, Brad, you're the premier, or the premier designate. And so that was, I'll never forget.
How did that feel?
Well, it was amazing. It was humbling in that moment, and that feeling really never left me for the 10 years I had the honor to serve. But it really crystallized in that moment, and I'll never, ever forget that particular quick exchange. And then we went inside the house and watched a bit more of the results.
It's easy for you, Brad. You've never lost one. No wonder you're so happy.
Valid point.
No wonder you look so good all the time.
We were fortunate, David. We had a good team, good timing, and good luck.
You had great leadership, and no time. You don't have to be modest here.
Let me bring Mr. Dosanjh on, because I had you on earlier this week. You come in with a very unique perspective in that you're probably one of the only people in the country that understands what Kathleen Wynne is going through right now, because you also conceded an election before the actual vote. How difficult? How much empathy do you have for her tonight?
Well, I think that she probably feels a sense of being liberated in a sense that she's been campaigning hard, regardless of the concession, trying to win some seats for the party. Therefore, she knows that she's going to lose the election. Therefore, there's no tension in her mind, except the only tension is that she wants to make sure that some seats are won, the party status is not lost in the legislature. Therefore, I think she's the freest of the three in that sense. And I think the only question she's pondering tonight, probably, other than the number of seats, is whether or not she's going to resign as the party leader tonight as she makes the concession speech.
What do you think she'll do?
Well, I can tell you what I did. My advisors were advising against it, and I basically said, look, I mean, I'm finished. I think I should free up the field for others to contend, and the party should be at peace rather than with knives out for one another. So I resigned the night as I made the concession speech, and that was the best thing I ever did, because then nobody tried to stab me or say anything bad about me. You know, you don't kind of whip a dead horse, right? So I think that so I think that might be a good thing for her to do.
Mr. Peterson?
One of the realities of losing in politics,
absolutely,
you have to take responsibility. That's what leadership does. And Ujo referred to that, and I think that's when I lost, I stood up and I resigned. Now, but also depends in these circumstances how many seats are left. You have to think about your party, you have to think about transition, you have to think about the next leadership. So who knows what will be left? So I think what she does tonight, and she is a very intelligent and classy human being. She will take responsibility, as she has to, but what she does specifically will depend. She may have to stay for a while, work with the party to arrange a transition of leadership. Who knows? We could be in a minority situation where her voice is very, very important in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So we're still waiting for that.
Mr. Wall, you're nodding. I see you there.
David makes an excellent point. What if tonight's result is a minority by basically by 1 seat? In other words, a majority is deprived by just 1. I think, and I've sat across the table from Premier Wynne now on many occasions. I think she's absolutely the kind of leader that's going to think about these things, think about her party, think about the impact on the legislature itself, the configuration at Queen's Park, and I think that's the kind of person Kathleen is, and I think Premier Wynne will be taking close stock of the actual results tonight before she makes her final decision as to what she'll say in her speech.
Brad's worked with her, and he knows and he's worked with a lot of premiers, as Ujo, and other people. He knows what a classy woman and intelligent woman she is. This is not
She's
about her.
also very formidable if you happen to be on the opposite side of an issue.
Well,
yeah, and obviously that commends itself to leadership too, David.
I agree with that. And I saw her this week, and I can tell you she's at peace, and she's not sitting there. She's not bitter. She is not thinking inappropriately. She's not lashing out, and I guarantee you this. A year from now, she'll be viewed totally differently than she is today.
On that note, I do have to take a quick break, but we will be back with the Premier's League. If the PCs win this election, provincial-federal relations could turn sour. Doug Ford plans to challenge the Liberal government's carbon pricing plan. Up next, as I mentioned, the Premier's League will be back for another round, this time to discuss potential effects of this election on the Federation. Welcome back to this special edition of Power in Politics. I'm Vassy Kapelos, and we are live from outside the CBC Broadcasting Centre in Toronto, bringing you extensive coverage of the Ontario election. By the end of today, Ontario is expected to have a new premier. Liberal leader Kathleen Wynne conceded defeat this week, and polls suggest a virtual tie between the PC's Doug Ford and the NDP's Andrea Horwath, at least with popular support. The entire nation is watching because this isn't just about Ontario. The conclusion will have far-reaching consequences for a federation that right now is kind of fractured over pipelines and climate policy. So what is at stake here for Canada? The Premier's League is back for another round. From Vancouver, we're joined by former BC Premier Ujjal Dosanjh. In Saskatoon, former Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall, now Special Advisor at Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt LLP. And with me here in Toronto, former Ontario Premier David Peterson, Chairman Emeritus and Senior Counsel at Castles Brock Lawyers. Hi again, everyone. Thanks again. Mr. Dosanjh, why don't I start with you, because we've discussed a few times on the show already how fractured the relationship is in certain parts of this country between the provinces and the federal government. What does a Doug Ford government, Doug Ford-led government in Ontario mean for the federal Liberals from your vantage point?
Well, I think it means some trouble on the environment file. Obviously, the planning that and the policy that Mr. Trudeau is following in terms of the carbon tax is going to face some resistance if Mr. Ford is the premier. If the NDP, on the other hand, wins the election, Mr. Trudeau's life might be a little easier on some of these policies. In terms of the pipeline, I mean, that issue it won't be impacted by whether or not you have Doug Ford or Andrea Horwath, but the carbon issue absolutely will be impacted. And in fact, it might become slightly more difficult to govern in terms of the federal, provincial premiers and first ministers conferences with Doug Ford, who sometimes is you can't tell what he's going to do. He's unpredictable. So going into federal, provincial conferences or first ministers conferences, there might be a great deal of uncertainty as to where Ontario might stand. And I think that is not good for the Federation, not to say that I'm a partisan, but the federal government and the provinces need to be able to work on these very important issues in somewhat of a nonpartisan way.
Mr. Peterson, let me ask you, as a former premier of this province, the biggest economy, the most populous province, how significant is it on to the country as a whole? How this election?
It is extremely significant. And here's why. There's no other federation in the world where one piece is so important, 40% of the GDP. And it's one of the most jurisdiction that's diverse in its responsibilities. So they have so much, the provinces have so much power. When I was here, I spent a great deal of time building relationships with Quebec, with Ottawa, and with my friends in the West, with Don Getty, and with Grant Devine, and others, and Bill Bennett. And these were great Canadians. And even Peter Lougheed, who was there, he was a local guy, but he never forgot the national interest. And I think how this is approached, and the size of the hearts and the understanding of the needs and pressures in this great country are going to be really strained in the next little while. And I really hope they can all step up to it. Look what's happening out west now. It's sad for the country what's happening. And I get it, and I'm not getting into the issues here, but let me just say, if we can't find answers, we're going to put pressures on this confederation like we've never had before.
Mr. Wall, what do you think about that?
Well, I agree. There's pressures coming on the Federation, notwithstanding the result tonight in Ontario, but certainly the Ontario election will play a part in informing the intensity, I guess, of that tension, of that stress. We also have an Alberta election coming up probably within a year, and we have the equalization debate or discussion that looms as that federal program needs to be renewed, and I think those are all pressure points that are upcoming. I'd just say this about tonight's election. I mean, obviously, I think as your viewers will know that Saskatchewan is the holdout on the carbon tax, and my successor, Premier Moe, has indicated that continues to be the position of the province of Saskatchewan, and if need be, will go to court. There haven't been a lot of allies on that position, admittedly so, around the table. That could change tonight. There could be a very powerful ally. David's appropriately canvassed the influence of Ontario and the Federation, not just economically, but in terms of politics and the Federation itself. And based on what Ford has said during the campaign, Saskatchewan might expect to have an ally in that court case, if it comes to that, against the federal government carbon tax, and maybe another one in just less than a year when the Alberta situation may or may not change, I guess. I would also offer this thought. Regardless of whether or not it's Premier Horwath or Premier Ford tonight, Ontarians will have weighed in on a pretty important issue in the election campaign, and that is the issue of environmental policy and its impact on families and businesses vis-a-vis electricity rates. Because we all want to get to the point where energy's cleaner. There's no doubt about it. Whether you support a carbon tax or not, we want to get to the point where where renewables, where clean energy is the baseload energy for the world. That should be the focus of everybody. But if you move precipitously on that front, there's an impact, a policy impact, and one that will hit the voters, one that hits families in terms of the rates that they pay for electricity there in Ontario or anywhere else, and it hurts your competitiveness potentially in the short, the midterm, and possibly the long term. Now, the architect for some of this policy anyway would have been an advisor to Mr. Premier McGuinty, Gerald Butts. He's the advisor to the Prime Minister today, and much of what we see from the current federal government, I think, is similar to what we saw in Ontario years ago that's led to this point. And so I think the election tonight is informative about the impact politics of some of the ideas that we've seen even imposed federally, but certainly it'll tell us a lot about how voters in Ontario feel about the impact of environmental policy in their province.
But Brad, can I say something? And I do believe this. I believe as Ontario, as the biggest and the richest, has the biggest responsibility to reach out and assist the smooth functioning of this confederation. I think we have more responsibility than some of the smaller provinces that don't have the economic might. But at the same time, this depends on the quality of the people that are coming forward, who reflect their electorates, who believe at the end of the day this federation is worth fighting for. I saw it, interesting enough, in the original Meech Lake discussions in 1987, 1990, when I saw acts of leadership of Don Getty and Michael Harcourt and Grant Devine that people were yelling at them all the time. They could have easily turned on those situations, but they put the interests of the nation first. So our Prime Minister is going to have to call on the best instincts of these guys, or these people, whoever elected, and they have a responsibility to think of the Confederation as well.
Mr. Desange, the last word to you.
I think David makes a great point. I think in the past, historically, Ontario has stood for the Federation in a much more dignified way that has brought the country together. Vis-a-vis Quebec, I think Ontario has always been at the center of negotiations to keep Quebec with us. And I think whoever wins is going to have that responsibility going forward on many of these issues the Federation faces.
Okay, thank you very much to all three of you. Thanks to the Premiers League, Ujjal Desange, Brad Wall, and David Peterson.
Fun to be with you guys.
Thanks, David. See you, Vassy.
See ya. Indigenous leaders say Indigenous issues have been ignored in this election campaign, and they worry that that's a harbinger of what's to come. How do they plan to get their issues back on the agenda? Ontario Regional Chief Isidore Day will join us after this break. Welcome back to this special edition of Power and Politics. I'm Vassy Kapelos, and we're live from outside the CBC Broadcasting Centre in Toronto. This city and surrounding communities is home to 47 of Ontario's 124 seats. That's why the major party leaders have spent much of this campaign in the GTA. There is one constituency of voters, though, who feel, for the large part, that they've been ignored. Indigenous leaders say little attention has been paid to their issues. Unusual, given Ontario is home to the country's largest Indigenous population, and the province has the highest number of drinking water advisories on reserve. Why have Indigenous issues been missing from this campaign? Joining me now is Ontario Regional Chief Isidore Jay. Hi, Chief Day. Nice to see you.
It's good to be here.
Thank you for your time. There most likely will be a new government tomorrow. Kathleen Wynne has already conceded defeat. Before I ask you about how you'll work or how you'll try to advocate for your issues with a new government, what has it been like with the current government, and do you feel that your agenda has been advanced under this government?
Well, I think a lot of talk around First Nations issues have been advanced at tables with governments. There certainly has been efforts made by the Wynne Liberal government over the last several years, and prior to that, Premier McGuinty, to listen to issues around First Nation jurisdiction. These were hard-pressed issues back in the McGuinty days, and we really fought hard to get ourselves involved in things like the energy sector. Now we are looking at, being elevated in terms of better outcomes in education and better health. So we certainly have seen a lot of talk. This next government is going to have to move the yardsticks, taking it out of neutral and moving forward on some issues.
So what's your level of faith that will happen? We don't know what's going to happen, and of course there are a few hours before we figure that one out. But if the polls are correct, it looks likely that it could be a PC government. How do you advance your agenda if that's the case?
Well, it doesn't matter what government there is. First Nations issues are always going to remain the same. There's a very interesting political landscape that's played itself out in the country. We see, again, the previous speakers were talking about, the energy sector across the country and the issue of economy. First Nations in our territory, in the province of Ontario, there's 38% of Canada's GDP is in Ontario. This province is covered by treaties. So you can rest assured, Vassy, that First Nations will be clearly putting and squarely on the lap of the next premier. We need to deal with land rights issues and resource revenue sharing in a way that's substantive, in a way that recognizes our First Nation jurisdictions.
What do you mean by substantive?
Well, what I mean by that is it can no longer be, let's wait until we pull some rocks out of the ground and produce that and extract rare minerals, or pull trees and send it to the lumber mills. Listen, again, 38% of Canada's GDP. There's a lot of money happening in this province, and this really is where Canada established itself as a country through the treaties here in this particular region. So we've got to get back to the treaties, and just recently the Robinson-Huron Treaty annuities case just heard its final arguments in Sudbury. This is looking at moving the scales from a $4 a year annuity to something that's more comparable to today's values. And again, we don't want to live in poverty anymore, and we have rights to be treated like first-class citizens, just like everywhere else in this country.
I want to ask you about something you said on the show when you were on just a few days ago. You said you felt there had been really no attempt by any of the party leaders to engage First Nations in Ontario. And I wanted to ask you why you think that is.
Well, listen, I'm going to put it out there. We hear of a lot of discussion around reconciliation. We've seen, people study us time and time again. We had the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. All the solutions are there. It's not that we don't know what the solutions are. You need to deal with land issues in this province and right across the country. And I believe that provincial governments right across the land are having a difficult time trying to figure out how to do that. And I know, again, in this province, based on the deep wealth that exists here, the next government is going to have to grapple with moving beyond the Indian Act and finally recognizing us as part of Ontario's economy.
Do you think it's an unease or a lack of answers about how to answer those questions that prevents them from at least from your perspective, engaging on these issues during this campaign? What do you think it is that has led to that?
I think it's going to have to happen on a number of different fronts. There certainly is a lack of understanding. Obviously, you need to have us sitting at the table. Whenever the federal family decides that they want to discuss something like health care or the cannabis legislation and they want to share the excise tax 75 to 25% split for the federal government, we're not part of those discussions, which leaves us out of the framework in terms of how then do we deal with those issues in our communities? How do we participate in the economy? And again, if the federal family wants to find solutions, we have to be at the table.
Okay, thanks a lot, Chief Day. Real pleasure to have you on the show again.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're watching a special extended edition of Power in Politics. We're here in Toronto to cover the Ontario election, but we're also tracking another major political story in Ottawa. The Senate is voting on the government's marijuana bill at any moment. How likely is it to pass? We'll get an update on where things stand right after this.
We have certainly scrutinised it exhaustively from end to end and top to bottom, but one can never be sure about these things. This is the way democracy works.
The immediate future for me is to ensure that Indigenous youth in particular, but all recreational users would not continue to be prosecuted.
I have a hard time with people who say, trust me, we'll make it work. I've been in sales all my life and I've used that line, but you got to be careful that when you say, trust me, I'll make it work, you better make sure it works.
We're back with a special edition of Power and Politics live from Toronto. Back in Ottawa, senators are still debating the government's landmark legislation to legalize the recreational use of weed. Senators have passed 46 amendments, which makes for a lot of changes to the government's original bill. If it's passed, then the amended legislation heads back to the House of Commons for final approval. So when will the senators finish voting? We're checking back in with the CBC's Catherine Cullen, who joins me from the foyer of the Senate. Hi, Catherine. Bring us up to speed. What's going on?
Well, Vassy, they just heard from Conservative Senator Elizabeth Marshall making a very impassioned speech about the health harms that come along with marijuana. She is arguing that the government is disregarding all those health harms by legalizing. The government, of course, we know from hearing them talk about this many times, would respond that they believe they can better protect Canadians from those health harms by legalizing and regulating cannabis, and that is what they're hoping to do. But of course, a lot depends on what happens there tonight. We are all watching our watches right now. I can tell you it's the conversation in the corridors outside the Senate. Will the senators continue talking before they vote for another hour, 2 hours, 3 hours? I'm not sure, frankly, Vassy, send snacks, but we are expecting this to wrap up. It will wrap up before midnight tonight. It's just a question of when and, of course, what the outcome of that crucial vote will be.
Do we have any sense of how the government might react to the Senate's proposed amendments?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, 46 amendments so far. It's possible that there could be more, and the government has been keeping its cards close to its chest. The people I've asked certainly have not been willing to say. They note that the Senate is more independent now. They're not 100% sure what will happen tonight, although I think there's some optimism about it. And so they're going to be looking at each amendment individually. Some of them are technical, but some of them are issues about helping protect a province's right to ban home grow, even though the federal legislation allows for home grow. Something like that could be a tricky question for the government. We're not quite sure where they're going to come down, so we're going to be watching here tonight very carefully to see what happens, and very likely going to have to be watching the discussions that are going to happen over on the House side in Cabinet as well about how they decide to respond to this litany of suggested changes to this legislation.
Thanks so much, Catherine. The CBC's Catherine Cullen from the Senate foyer. Stay with us. We've got more special coverage of the Ontario election after this. Welcome back to this special edition of Power and Politics. I'm Vassy Kapelos, live from outside the CBC Broadcasting Centre in Toronto, bringing you extensive coverage of the Ontario election. Polls are open for another 2 hours in most parts of the province. What we know is that Ontario is poised for change, but who will lead that change is the results we're waiting for. We could be in for a big finish to what's been a roller coaster of a race. That's why we'll be here for another hour of live coverage. We'll hear from some Ontario mayors about what they're watching for tonight. We'll check back in with the reporters on the scene, and our Ontario panel will be back to help us count down to when polls close. There is lots more ahead, but first, here are some highlights so far from Election Day.
I'm excited about the possibilities that await us tonight and tomorrow. Should we be given that opportunity to really be the government that continues to push Ontario forward and build on some of the positive things that have been done by the government. Because let's face it, there have been some positive things that have been done by this government. But unfortunately, there were also some things that have been broken and we need to fix.
Feeling really great. Beautiful day. To change Ontario.
Are you confident that you're going to be the next leader of Ontario?
I never take anything for granted. I'm just going to continue working hard right up to the last minute.
Election day is always a special day because there are always unknowns, and there's some knowns and some unknowns today. And I'm looking forward to what the people of Ontario decide. It's going to be an exciting night.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of Power and Politics, and welcome to viewers joining us on CBC TV. I'm Vassy Kapelos. We are live from outside the CBC Broadcasting Centre in Toronto, just a few blocks away from Queen's Park, where polls suggest a new government could take the reins after 15 years of Liberal rule in this province. It's Election Day here in Ontario, and several million people have either cast their ballots already or are on their way to their polling stations. Our countdown clock is on. Voting ends in 2 hours in most parts of the province. A lot is at stake in this election, not just for Ontario, but for the rest of the country. And we'll be discussing all of it over the next hour. We've got our panel of party strategists to discuss the swings and misses of the campaign. Plus, what are the candidates thinking and feeling at this moment? We'll speak with 3 former premiers for that perspective. And does this vote set the table for the 2019 federal election? MPs will be here to discuss. But first, we've got reporters staked out at all 3 campaign headquarters. That's where we begin our coverage this evening. The CBC's Mike Crawley is with the PCs, Chris Glover is on the NDP floor, and Lisa Shing joins us from the Liberal camp. Let's begin with CBC's Chris Glover. He's again with the NDP at the Hamilton Convention Centre. Hi, Chris. This could be a historic night for that party. Where are they hoping to pick up seats in this election?
In a lot of different parts of the province. Really, in 2014, they had a bit of a rough showing, only getting around 20 seats, and they were completely shut out of the eastern part of the province, for example. So places like Ottawa and Kingston, Peterborough, those areas of the province, they're really hoping to make some inroads. You saw leader Andrea Horwath over the course of this campaign make several stops to some of those ridings, hoping to gain some seats in those areas. Also within the city of Toronto. In Toronto in 2014, the NDP only had 2 seats after that election, so they'll certainly hope to pick up some seats there, as well as the all-important GTA, Greater Toronto area, that area around the city of Toronto. The NDP also only had 2 seats in that part of the province after the 2014 vote, so it gives you a bit of a sense of the amount of work that the NDP had to do over the course of this campaign. I was just talking to a strategist. They said that one of the things that they were banking on more than anything else was the anti-Doug Ford vote. The PC leader, for some people in the province, is deeply unpopular, and so they are thinking that that's one of the ways that they will be able to propel themselves to victory. They're obviously very nervous and anxious about this result tonight, but they're also pretty optimistic, Vassy.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Let's move back to Toronto and to the CBC's Lisa Shing. She's at the York Mills Gallery with the Liberal Party. Lisa, what happens if the Liberals don't get the 8 seats they need to maintain official party status?
Well, Vassy, really those 8 seats are key to maintaining that status, and we're watching some ridings, especially in the Toronto and Ottawa area, that could be key in deciding that. Now, if the Liberals don't meet that threshold, essentially it means that they don't get funding for things like research as well as staffing, so definitely a leaner party overall. But I did speak with a strategist who says not all is lost. She points to federal Green Party leader Elizabeth May as an example. She says she holds press conferences, is very vocal, gets a lot of media attention, and that's certainly something the Liberal Party can continue doing even if they don't maintain status. But most importantly, Vassy, she says really it's a time for the party to take a step back, to reflect on the last 15 years, if you will, to rebuild as well as regroup. So certainly meeting that 8 seats would be key to being more effective, but again, not all is lost.
Thanks, Lisa. Let's check in now with Mike Crawley. He's at the Toronto Congress Centre with the PC party. Mike, the PCs appear to have a pretty good shot at a majority, but it hasn't exactly been the smoothest ride there. What do you make of how the PCs handled the ups and the downs?
Yeah, certainly the Progressive Conservatives would have liked the campaign to have gone more smoothly, but Doug Ford stayed on message. This was one of kind of the key things that happened here, is that he kept talking about putting more money back in the taxpayer's pocket. He kept talking about bringing change to the province. It was also interesting to see how well the PCs pivoted when, at the beginning, Kathleen Wynne was their major opponent, and they fairly quickly realized, I think even before a lot of pollsters realized, that the NDP was surging, and you could see a change in the messaging there. So there were controversies along the way, for sure, not the least which of what happened just on Monday, when it was revealed that there was a lawsuit against Doug Ford by Rob Ford's widow, Renata, over his managing of the family estate. So, you know, if the PCs win their majority, the way the campaign rolled out, everything worked out just well for them, right? So all of those problems will be forgotten. If they don't get that majority, there'll be a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking going on and looking at what happened along the campaign. Vassy?
Makes sense. Thanks a lot, Mike. Some have called this race a battle of right versus left, populist versus progressive. Either way, sweeping change could be coming to Canada's largest province. So when voters wake up tomorrow, what kind of change should they be bracing for? Joining me from Ottawa, as they have been throughout the campaign, is political commentator Rob Silver, who we have to disclose is married to the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, and Denise Ciele, a partner at Hill Solutions Public Affairs. Here with me in Toronto is former NDP MP, now distinguished visiting professor at Ryerson University, Olivia Chow. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you back again.
Yes.
Denise, why don't I start with you? We looked back in the last segment at the campaign. I want to look forward now. If Doug Ford is premier tomorrow, what is his first order of business? Not officially premier, I shouldn't say, not sworn in, but if he wins, what is his first order of business?
Right. So as premier-elect, and certainly one of the first things that he's going to do is to reach out to Ontarians from all parties to assure them that he is premier for all. And I think that's a classic of any new political leader in a province or even federally. The second thing he absolutely has to do is to establish what that front bench might look like. So maybe that's early next week, and there's a combination of very, very competent incumbent MPPs, presuming they get elected, in the form of Vic Fideli, Elisa MacLeod in Eastern Ontario, presumably Christine Elliott and Caroline Mulrooney, to really just establish, again, those portfolios where he's been talking about it. He's been talking about education. So who is he going to place in that file to shepherd the vision that the PCs have been sharing in health in particular? And of course, the big one is finance. Who's going to clean up in whatever way that they can, the Ontario finances. And then lastly, the portfolio around hydro and electricity. So energy, those are going to be big ones. And I think for a premier-elect Doug Ford, he has to get out there almost immediately, as would any other leader, really, to establish who's going to be his front bench.
Olivia, this is Andrea Horvath's third election as leader. I'll ask you the same question. If she wins tonight, what's her first order of business tomorrow?
I think she'll say thank you to the people in Ontario. And I think she will immediately, once she formed the government, to hire the nurses and the doctors and invest in the hospitals so we don't have hallway medicine, so people don't have to wait so long to get.
So you think healthcare will be her first priority?
I think healthcare and also connective healthcare is two aspects. Is the home care, because seniors need more hours in home care and more nursing home beds, and also key thing, dental care, because it's so expensive to get your teeth fixed, and that in all of those, health is one of the top priority. And the second one would be education. Education for little kids, which is early childhood education, childcare, and education for elementary and secondary school, because a lot of schools are really falling apart. So other than making sure there's more teachers, but fixing the schools, because the schools really, are not doing well. So healthcare, education, I believe would be some of her top priority. And of course, hydro. Right?
Everyone loves hydro.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to buy back hydro so we can lower the rate by 30%.
Okay, Rob, I'm going to ask you a similar but very differently phrased question because, of course...
Wait, transition. We got to talk about the Liberal transition to power tomorrow.
Right, yeah.
Sorry, what was your question, Vassy?
My question is not really about transition, I apologize, but more about what happens, what is the calculation for Kathleen Wynne in deciding essentially how long to stay on?
Well, when you effectively say you're not going to win the campaign a week before the election, it would be rather surprising if she didn't announce tonight that or tomorrow morning that she was resigning as Liberal leader. There'd be a tiny bit of a disconnect there. I'm not trying to make light of the situation, obviously, that the Ontario Liberal Party is going to face tonight, whether they're an official party or not. And my guess is it's going to be close. I wouldn't be surprised if they fall short of 8 seats. I wouldn't be shocked if they get over 8 seats. It'll be interesting in some ways in that sense. But no, the Ontario Liberal Party is a massive rebuilding job. Financially, they're going to be in a lot of trouble coming out of this election, whether they're an official party or not. It's quite serious in terms of reconnecting with Ontarians. The only thing I'd say is I'm old enough to remember the 2011 federal election night, and I was on a network similar to this one, Vassy, on election night, on a campaign I had nothing to do with. And there were quite literally books written about the death of the Liberal Party in 2011. In fact, the title of that book was The Death of the Liberal Party. So that's not a prediction. I'm not trying to be glib. It's going to be a bad, serious night, and it's going to be a long road back for the Ontario Liberal Party. But I think that the pundits who say this is it for the Liberal Party of Ontario are going to be making a mistake tomorrow morning in their columns.
Okay, I have just 2 minutes left, so I want to do a bit of a lightning round. Denise, I'll start with you. What's the one thing you're going to be watching for tonight?
Well, there's multiple things, but I will say
one.
this. No, I have to pick three.
One.
No, one.
Momentum for the progressive conservatives, a rallying around the PC message, and more importantly, Ontarians will wake up tomorrow feeling very, very confident about the government that they've elected.
Okay, Olivia, what's the one thing you're watching for?
Will the Liberals that want to stop Doug Ford be voting for Andrew Horwath, NDP, so that we can vote together to stop Ford?
I wish we had enough seats, Olivia, for that to matter. I'm going to be watching Guelph. If the Green Party wins a seat in the legislature, that first seat in any province is the hardest seat to win. I'm not a Green supporter, but the Greens winning in Guelph, regardless of who forms a majority government tonight, would be a massive breakthrough for the Ontario Green Party, and that, for them, will be a big, big thing. So we'll see if they win in Guelph.
Okay, thanks everyone for your insight. Thanks to Denise Ciele, Rob Silver, and Olivia Chow. Ontario is home to a lot of big cities, many of which are grappling with crumbling infrastructure and weak transit. Problems only a premier can address. What are mayors watching for tonight? We'll speak to 3 of them right after this. Welcome back to this special edition of Power in Politics. I'm Vassy Kapelos, and we are live from outside the CBC Broadcasting Centre in Toronto, bringing you extensive coverage of the Ontario election. Whoever becomes Premier tonight, that person will be greeted with a list of wants and needs from city mayors across the province, from transit to infrastructure to housing refugees. What demands will land on the desk of Ontario's next Premier? Joining me now from Windsor is Mayor Drew Dilkens. In Sudbury is Mayor Brian Bigger. And with me here in Toronto is Mississauga Mayor Bonnie Crombie. Hello to all 3 mayors. Thank you for being with us.
Hi, Vassy.
Hi, Vassy.
Great to see you. Mayor Crombie, I'm going to start with you.
Okay.
And I'm going to actually ask all 3 of you the same question. You've all lived your own election nights. Do you envy the candidates tonight, or are you happy to just be sitting back and watching?
Oh my goodness. Well, I've had 4 elections. I've won 3 of the 4, and it's tough to lose. And of course, tonight there will be some incumbents that will lose their seats, and it's a difficult transition for them. So we're anticipating everything tonight. There'll be lots of change, I expect.
Mayor Dilkens, what about you? Are you happy to just be an outside observer at this point?
Yeah, you're darn right I am. I too have lost an election in the past, so I know what it feels like, but I know what it feels like to win. So there'll be a lot of folks in Ontario tonight who are very, very excited after a win, and I'm sure there'll be a few that are very disappointed with the results.
Mayor Bigger, what's this night like for someone running in an election, the night of the election?
I'm a first-term mayor. I'm glad to be watching the provincial election, and and understanding what's important to the citizens is really key for me. So I'm listening carefully.
Mayor Crombie, this Liberal government has been in power for 15 years.
Yes.
Whether you're agreeing with their policies or not, you're used to at least working with them. Is there any nervousness or concern on your part about the idea of the unknown and what will you be greeted with tomorrow?
Well, certainly, we've had a great provincial partner in the current government. They've invested deeply into cities, into municipalities. It's given us a number of new issues, new transit, our light rail transit, a new hospital. So, of course, we're a little bit concerned whether the new government, as elected tonight, will uphold those commitments, and we're very hopeful that they will, because it's very critical for the people of Mississauga. We have run a campaign called Mississauga Matters, and we've let all the leaders and all the parties and their candidates know about our issues in Mississauga.
What are, if you're to detail what the top issues are, like just a couple,
absolutely.
What are
so
they?
You, in fact, have already highlighted them. We want to continue the investment into infrastructure, into transit, transportation, and to affordable housing. In fact, everyone's got their issues with respect to affordable housing. Specifically, the issues that matter to me are light rail transit. It was $1.4 billion commitment made by the current government. We want to ensure that that light rail transit is built. Much of our economic development is dependent on it. Jobs, prosperity, growth is dependent on that train. We've committed to a new hospital build. We need 500 new beds in Mississauga. And of course, the gas tax is critical to us for investment into our transit and culturally sensitive long-term care beds as well. So those are some commitments that have been made.
It's a detailed list.
Yes, but those are commitments that are vital to us in our economy, and probably the other mayors will agree. And we're very hopeful that the new government, whoever it may be, will honor those commitments.
Mayor Bigger, what are some of the issues that are unique to Sudbury that you're looking for, that you're watching for tonight?
Well, one thing that's important in the North is looking towards future growth and investment in our community, and investment that creates jobs. So stimulating investment in economic development is very important to us. Roads, condition of our infrastructure, and having predictable, reliable sources of funding for infrastructure is also very, very key for us. And we're investing significantly in a number of areas that have a positive influence on the quality of life in our community, including a significant strategy to improve our transit services.
Mayor Dilkens, what's your level of concern for the change in government that seems almost inevitable tomorrow, and what issues specifically underlie your interest in that outcome?
Well, infrastructure is a big one, Vassy. I think Mayor Crombie would also agree. Last week we were in Halifax with other big city mayors, and those of us from Ontario certainly are wanting to make sure that there's a commitment for the flow through of the Phase 2 infrastructure fund, so we can make those investments in each of our communities. In the city of Windsor, one of the big issues that we have is hospital. And so we have moved to the next phase in a new hospital build. It's about a $2 billion project. And the whole community has rallied. The city council, the county council have rallied behind to come up with their share, $200 million to see this project happen. But of course, not knowing who's going to get in power gives you a little bit of an uneasy feeling, because you want to make sure that that big project goes. And then I think, at the end of the day, what we have here, and probably what we've had for the last couple of years building up, is really a hydro referendum. And from a perspective in the city of Windsor, I'm not just competing against Toronto and other cities in Ontario. I'm competing against cities that are literally 1.5 kilometers across the border. Mm-hmm. And so trying to be and make sure that the province, that we can be in a competitive situation with our businesses here vis-a-vis who we're competing against, I think is vital. So whoever forms government, of course, they're all talking about hydro and the cost of hydro. It's imperative that they come up with a plan to deal with these rising and escalating costs moving forward.
Mayor Crombie, if the polls are correct, the popular vote is extremely close. It could be a minority government or a majority government. Do you have a preference as to what you'd like to work with?
I just want a cooperative partner that will work with our cities, with our municipalities, that will honor the bilateral agreements that have been signed, so the federal money continues to flow through to the municipalities, who will sit down and talk with us and discuss the need for different revenue streams that are more predictable, long-term, and sustainable, such as more than the gas tax funding.
Talking to your constituents, how close do you feel that race is? Do you feel like the polls are reflective of what you hear?
You know, it's difficult to speculate. I'm hearing Mississauga could completely turn over. I'm here maybe 1 or 2 seats will be. It's hard to say right now. It just depends on the vote splitting. I was in this position in 2011 as a federal member, and of course with the rise of the NDP, the Liberals lost our seats. Conservatives won a majority government. Something like that could happen this time. Looks like 2011 federal.
Mayor Bigger, do you have the sense that among your constituents that they are reflective of what we see in the polls as well?
I would say it's difficult to tell right now. You know, at this point in time, until the results come in. But I do hear people talking about the need for healthcare, improved healthcare. We are a hub in Northern Ontario and servicing about 600,000 people here, and so that's an important topic for us. But difficult to speculate right now which direction we'll go in.
Mm-hmm.
Mayor Dilkens, have you been talking to your constituents, and what impression have they left you with?
Well, I sense that we're going to maintain our 3 NDP ridings here that we have already today. I think you'll see in Windsor Conservatives having a very strong showing based on Mr. Ford's visit just about a week ago, where they were standing room only and apparently lined up out the door. That's not something we've ever seen in a long time in the city of Windsor, and we've not had a Conservative rep in the city of Windsor proper since about somewhere in the mid-1960s. So I think there's some increased interest, and I wouldn't be surprised to see Liberals probably taking the 3rd place spot in at least 2 of the 3 ridings.
Okay, very quickly, did all 3 of you vote?
Oh yes, I voted in the advance polls.
Okay, what about you?
Yes, I went at lunch hour.
And you, Mayor Bigger?
I'm going to vote after our interview.
You're heading there now. All right, I won't hold you back. Thank you so much to all 3 of you mayors, Drew Dilkens, Brian Bigger, and Bonnie Crombie. So how are voters feeling about this election? Are they excited, angry, confused? The CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick has been speaking to some of them today. We'll check in with her after this quick break. Welcome back to this special edition of Power in Politics. I'm Vassy Kapelos, and we are live from outside the CBC Broadcasting Centre in Toronto. It's decision day here in Ontario after a dramatic provincial election campaign. So how are voters feeling as they cast their ballots? The CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick has been hanging out in Toronto outside a polling station. Hi, Megan, great to see you. What are you hearing from voters today?
Oh, I'm hearing so many different things, Vassy. It's been so interesting to talk to voters today about what parties they're supporting and why. I started my day in the riding of Don Valley West, and that's the riding that Kathleen Wynne represents. I was there when she cast her ballot, and there are a lot of loyal Liberals in that riding who were telling me that they know Wynne is not going to be premier anymore, but they are really hoping that she hangs on to that seat because they've felt that she's a good MPP, and they want her to continue representing them at Queen's Park. I heard a lot about strategic voting today, Vassy. One woman in that riding said she normally votes Green because it's a safe Liberal seat and she just likes supporting the Green Party and showing some support, but she believes it's going to be such a tight race in Wynne's riding tonight between the PC candidate and her that she did vote Liberal. I talked to another woman who said she voted Liberal. She's not totally thrilled with Kathleen Wynne as the leader, and she maybe would have voted PC had Doug Ford not been the leader of that party. Quite a few people in that riding worried about what Doug Ford would mean as premier. I did meet a PC voter, though, who told me there's no way he would vote NDP. He's, again, not enthusiastic about Doug Ford, but ideologically, he's a PC voter and believes in smaller government and lower taxes. Let's take a listen to just a little bit more of what some voters were telling me in the riding of Don Valley West this morning. Take a listen.
I feel like it's like my duty to vote. I have to vote, but unfortunately it's a rock and a hard place on who you vote for, so I absolutely did a strategic vote.
I was sorry to see Kathleen Wynne do what she did in giving up the election because I think what she did will just make split the vote and let the PCs win.
And actually now I'm in the riding of Parkdale High Park in the west side of Toronto. This is an open riding. There's no incumbent. It was held by an NDP MPP, but I'm hearing a variety of opinions expressed here too. One woman literally just came out of this polling station in tears. She said she was very emotional for lots of different reasons. She cast a ballot for the NDP. She said she does not want to see Doug Ford become the premier of this province after tonight. So lots of different reactions and reasons for voting today here in Toronto.
Thanks, Megan. The CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick. The election may be in Ontario, but the results will be felt across the country. We've assembled 3 former premiers, and they will be here to discuss the potential effects of this election on the Federation right after this. Welcome back to this special edition of Power and Politics. I'm Vassy Kapelos, and we are live from outside the CBC Broadcasting Centre in Toronto, bringing you extensive coverage of the Ontario election. By the end of today, Ontario is expected to have a new premier, but this election isn't just about Ontario. The results will have far-reaching consequences for a federation that right now is fractured over pipelines and climate policy. Earlier, we spoke with three former premiers: former BC Premier Ujjal Dosanjh, former Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall, and former Ontario Premier David Peterson. I asked them what a Ford win would mean for the federal Liberals.
Well, I think it means some trouble on the environment file. Obviously, the planning that and the policy that Mr. Trudeau is following in terms of the carbon tax is going to face some resistance if Mr. Ford is the premier. If the NDP, on the other hand, wins the election, Mr. Trudeau's life might be a little easier on some of these policies. In terms of the pipeline, I mean, that issue it won't be impacted by whether or not you have Doug Ford or Andrea Horwath, but the carbon issue absolutely will be impacted. And in fact, it might become slightly more difficult to govern in terms of the federal, provincial premiers and first ministers' conferences with Doug Ford, who sometimes is you can't tell what he's going to do. He's unpredictable. So going into federal, provincial conferences or first ministers' conferences, there might be a great deal of uncertainty as to where Ontario might stand. And I think that is not good for the Federation. Not to say that I'm a partisan, but the federal government and the provinces need to be able to work on these very important issues in somewhat of a nonpartisan way.
Mr. Peterson, let me ask you, as a former premier of this province, the biggest economy, the most populous province, how significant is it to the country as a whole? How this election?
It is extremely significant, and here's why: there's no other federation in the world where one piece is so important, 40% of the GDP, and it's one of the most jurisdiction that's diverse in its responsibilities. So. They have so much, the provinces have so much power. When I was here, I spent a great deal of time building relationships with Quebec, with Ottawa, and with my friends in the West, with Don Getty, and with Grant Devine, and others, and Bill Bennett. And these were great Canadians. And even Peter Lougheed, who was there, he was a local guy, but he never forgot the national interest. And I think how this is approached, and the size of the hearts and the understanding of the needs and pressures in this great country are going to be really strained in the next little while. And I really hope they can all step up to it. Look what's happening out west now. It's sad for the country what's happening. And I get it, and I'm not getting into the issues here, but let me just say, if we can't find answers, we're going to put pressures on this confederation like we've never had before.
Mr. Wall, what do you think about that?
Well, I agree. There's pressures coming on the Federation, notwithstanding the result tonight in Ontario, but certainly the Ontario election will play a part in informing the intensity, I guess, of that tension, of that stress. We also have an Alberta election coming up probably within a year, and we have the equalization debate or discussion that looms as that federal program needs to be renewed, and I think those are all pressure points that are upcoming. I'd just say this about tonight's election. I mean, obviously, I think as your viewers will know that Saskatchewan is the holdout on the carbon tax, and my successor, Premier Moe, has indicated that continues to be the position of the province of Saskatchewan, and if need be, will go to court. There haven't been a lot of allies on that position, admittedly so, around the table. That could change tonight. There could be a very powerful ally. David's appropriately canvassed the influence of Ontario and the Federation, not just economically, but in terms of politics and the Federation itself. And based on what Ford has said up during the campaign, Saskatchewan might expect to have an ally in that court case, if it comes to that, against the federal government carbon tax, and maybe another one in just less than a year when the Alberta situation may or may not change, I guess. I would also offer this thought. Regardless of whether or not it's Premier Horwath or Premier Ford tonight, Ontarians will have weighed in on a pretty important issue in the election campaign, and that is the issue of environmental policy and its impact on families and businesses vis-a-vis electricity rates. Because we all want to get to the point where energy's cleaner. There's no doubt about it. Whether you support a carbon tax or not, we want to get to the point where where renewables, where clean energy is the baseload energy for the world. That should be the focus of everybody. But if you move precipitously on that front, there's an impact, a policy impact, and one that will hit the voters, one that hits families in terms of the rates that they pay for electricity there in Ontario or anywhere else, and it hurts your competitiveness potentially in the short, the midterm, and possibly the long term. Now, the architect for some of this policy anyway would have been an advisor to Mr. Premier McGuinty, Gerald Butts. He's the advisor to the Prime Minister today, and much of what we see from the current federal government, I think, is similar to what we saw in Ontario years ago that's led to this point. And so I think the election tonight is informative about the impact politics of some of the ideas that we've seen even imposed federally, but certainly it'll tell us a lot about how voters in Ontario feel about the impact of environmental policy in their province.
But Brad, can I say something? And I do believe this. I believe as Ontario, as the biggest and the richest, has the biggest responsibility to reach out and assist the smooth functioning of this confederation. I think we have more responsibility than some of the smaller provinces that don't have the economic might. But at the same time, this depends on the quality of the people that are coming forward, who reflect their electorates, who believe at the end of the day this federation is worth fighting for. I saw it, interesting enough, in the original Meech Lake discussions in 1987, 1990, when I saw acts of leadership of Don Getty and Michael Harcourt and Grant Devine that people were yelling at them all the time. They could have easily turned on those situations, but they put the interests of the nation first. So our Prime Minister is going to have to call on the best instincts of these guys, or these people who are ever elected, and they have a responsibility to think of the Confederation as well.
Mr. Desange, the last word to you.
I think David makes a great point. I think in the past, historically, Ontario has stood for the Federation in a much more dignified way that has brought the country together. Vis-a-vis Quebec, I think Ontario has always been at the center of negotiations to keep Quebec with us. And I think whoever wins is going to have that responsibility going forward on many of these issues the Federation faces.
Okay, thank you very much to all three of you. Thanks to the Premier's League, Ujjal Desange, Brad Wall, and David Peterson.
Fun to be with you guys.
Thanks, David. See you, Vassy.
See ya. The Ontario election could be seen as a dress rehearsal for next year's federal election. Will tonight's result determine how the federal parties plan their campaigns in 2019? I'll put that question to 3 Ontario MPs after this. Welcome back to this special edition of Power and Politics. I'm Vassy Kapelos. Polls in most of Ontario are open for just another hour and 15 minutes, and tonight's results will be closely watched in Ottawa. Many MPs are taking notes as they prepare for a federal election in 2019. In fact, many Ontario MPs are actively working for their provincial cousins to help get out the vote today. Earlier, I spoke with 3 of them. Here with me now in Toronto is Marco Mendicino, Ontario Liberal MP for Eglinton Lawrence. Joining me from Ottawa is Tony Clement, Ontario Conservative MP for Parry Sound Muskoka. And in Windsor is Tracy Ramsey, Ontario NDP MP for Essex. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being with us.
Great to be on.
Appreciate it. Okay, Mr. Mendicino, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to ask everybody the same question to start because I'm very interested. I know what team you're cheering for, but what specifically are you looking for tonight as in terms of efficiency and get out the vote, and what areas of the province are you really drilling down on?
Well, look, I'm back home in Toronto, and my riding is Eglinton Lawrence, which is actually right in the geographic heart of the city. But let's just start with the fact that we're celebrating an election. It's that one time in the electoral cycle where people get to go to the ballot box and put a name beside the representative that they think will best be their representative, in this case at Queen's Park. In my riding, that's Mike Cole, who's been doing it for a long time, and here's somebody who through thick and thin has been an incredible voice for our community. He has stood up for things like Postal Station K, the Eglinton Theatre. Most recently, he defended Columbus Centre. I mean, these are cultural hearts of our community. And obviously, more broadly than that, I think everybody is out there trying to motivate their volunteers. You know, this is the culmination. This is the sort of end point. And you can't thank them enough for the blood, sweat, and the tears that they put into it. There's a lot of emotions that go into Election Day, Vassy. And what we're really trying to do right now is just bring them across the finish line. Last thing I'll say is that Premier Wynne, who I was just with this past weekend at Casa Loma, where she mingled among thousands, was warmly embraced. And that was nice to see, because I think that she's had a tenure that she can be quite proud of with all the work that we've done in partnership with the federal government, and we're looking forward to working with the next government, whoever that is. That tenure, Mr. Clement, most likely will be over tonight. So what specifically are you looking for beyond, just hoping that your team crosses the finish line?
Well, it's been a long time, I must say, Vassy. I was part of a previous successful Progressive Conservative Ontario government. The last time the Ontario PCs won an election was 1999, so in case you're wondering, that was a previous century. So I think that there's a little bit of anticipation. Look, we don't know what's going to happen until it happens, but this is, I think, the one time since 1999 that PCs can say honestly say that there's a reasonable chance of forming a government. So I think at this point we're busy. Everybody's out there busy getting the voters out, as Marco mentioned as well. We've got a very well-trained team across the province, and we're looking forward to the ballots being counted.
Ms. Ramsey, we've seen the popular support for the NDP rise during this campaign for sure, but there are questions about the efficiency of that vote. What are you looking for tonight in that area?
Well, we have an army on the ground. We have so much positivity in our campaign right now. It's electric. People are incredibly excited about electing Andrea Horwath to be our next premier, and all of the incredible candidates that we have across Ontario. Our incumbent seats are very active, but of course we're growing. We're looking to take seats in southwestern Ontario, in the GTA, and back in the north. So it's a very exciting time for New Democrats, and it really is about people winning this election. And that's what New Democrats really want to see, is a province where we have a premier who they can trust, who they know will take care of their families. And so that's driving people out in record numbers for us to be out there on E-Day, of course, today, but they've been out there with us for this entire campaign, putting their blood, sweat, and tears into making sure that we have a progressive government in Ontario.
Mr. Mendicino, the polls are not everything, but obviously they don't bode well for your party right now. And there are people wondering if there'll even be enough seats to retain official party status. Are you worried about that?
Well, that's why it's so important to continue to motivate your volunteers.
So that
and
means
your
you are
workers.
worried?
Well, I think, look, we're obviously at a cycle in in governing. And as Tony pointed out, actually, it wasn't just last century, it was a different millennium. So look, we're motivating our people to go out there and to get the vote out, and we will obviously wait and see. And I do think that there is going to continue to be a very core group of voters who will support the Ontario Liberal Party, because ultimately we know, and this is true in Toronto, that many Ontarians are progressive. Those progressive values, wanting to really drive growth and to ensure that everybody has a shot at some success. And that has been one of the bedrock values that has informed the Ontario agenda, as well as us federally. But look, we've got to make sure that we get it across the finish line, and that's why right after this panel I'm going to be going back up to Eglinton Lawrence to poll vote.
Mr. Clement, I know you were involved in your local riding, but was there any hesitancy among members of your party about attaching yourself too much to the leadership of the PC party here in Ontario? I remember in the last federal election near the end there, Mr. Harper did an event with the Fords. It didn't go over so well. Were there any concerns on your part about that?
No, and in fact, I've been involved in this election campaign in about 10 ridings throughout the province. So I've seen it not only from my home riding of Parry Sound Muskoka, but in southwestern Ontario, in the GTA, and other areas as well. And there's a genuine excitement. I think that Doug Ford has been able to be disciplined. Look, he just started as leader in mid-March, so to come all this way in a very quick timeline is almost unprecedented. And I think it shows the discipline that he's shown, the fact that he's concentrated on people-friendly messages, whether it's the hydro rates or making life generally more affordable, lower taxes, cutting government waste. These are things that Ontarians have been waiting to hear from a political party for a long time. So there's a real excitement that has been brewing in this campaign, and it's culminating today.
Ms. Ramsey, I think it's maybe fair to say that at times over the past few months, it's been a bit of a struggle for Jagmeet Singh. How do you think your party at the federal level might be able to capitalize on the success the NDP has, at least in the polls so far, seen during this campaign?
Well, it's clear to us that when Ontarians are looking for a progressive party to represent them in this election, it's the NDP. So, of course, for us at the federal level, that's quite exciting. It's very exciting to see that Ontarians are, looking at us and looking at our platform, looking at the NDP and knowing that we have a fully costed platform, and also that we're the party that they trust right now. There's a lot of mistrust around Doug Ford. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of things that are happening, including, a not very solid platform that Ontarians are not willing to get behind. So progressive people are coming, flocking really to our campaigns on the ground, which is exciting. And of course, that always speaks well for us in terms of what we can do federally. I think in the last election federally, we certainly had a change election. And, in this particular case, Andrea Horwath is ready to be the Premier of Ontario. She's experienced in Queen's Park. I've seen her grow over this last period of time by leaps and bounds. This is a woman who has dedicated her career to becoming the Premier, and she's on the cusp of that. So that's very exciting for us. And of course, federally, everyone is watching what's happening as well. The collapse of the Liberals in Ontario, I'm sure, is making a lot of Liberals at the federal level quite nervous. But for us, it really is speaking to the fact that our progressive values and what people know us to be as a party is attracting them. So that's a positive thing for us both provincially and federally.
I have 30 seconds left, Mr. Mendocino, so I'll get the last question to you, picking up on what Ms. Ramsey said. How worried is your government right now about the possibility of Premier Ford?
Well, look, the Prime Minister has said that he is prepared to work with whatever government is elected, and
he always says that. But
no,
what's
I know,
the truth?
but the truth is that if you take a look at other examples, we've been able to forge important cooperation on things like health. There were a series of agreements which were struck with provincial governments of every stripe. And I think when you take a look at that, when you take a look at our partnership on infrastructure, and yes, true as well, when it comes to the environment, we're going to continue to cooperate.
Although Doug Ford wants to fight your carbon plan.
Well, look, the most important thing is that we have a dialogue, and the Prime Minister is collected to that. And the most important thing for Ontarians is to get out there and vote. This is really a day that we should all cherish, and I'm going to make sure that we go up there and get as many Liberal votes out there as possible for Mike Cole.
Okay, thank you all so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Tracy Ramsey, Tony Clement, and Marco Mendocino.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vassy.
Thanks.
The millennial vote could decide this election. Which way are they leaning? Hannah Thibodeau is here with that angle coming up next. Welcome back to this special edition of Power in Politics. I'm Vassy Kapelos here in Toronto. The clock is winding down to 9 p.m. Eastern when most of the polls in Ontario close and we start seeing results. Polls suggest the PCs and NDP are running very closely in the popular vote, but that is not how this race started. The CBC's Hannah Thibodeau has spent the past 4 weeks following the twists and turns of this dramatic race and joins me now. Hey, Hannah, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so like we just said, it was a clear, path to victory for Doug Ford initially, and then something changed.
Yeah, he had a 17-point lead going into this election campaign just over 4 weeks ago. However, there have been controversies for him and the party, candidate controversies. His, sister-in-law suing him in last week for $16.5 million, saying she mismanaged the party. So anything less for Doug Ford and the Conservatives at this point, even if they don't get a majority, it really could be seen as a loss for them, and it could be played out that way. So they really hope to get that majority tonight. As for NDP's Andrea Horwath, who they've been neck and neck with the Progressive Conservatives quite a way through, they say, a majority is good, a minority is possible, but even if they get official opposition, that is going to be one of the best standings for them since Bob Rae's government in the 1990s. So, of course, they're looking for change. What type of change? We're going to have to find out a little bit later.
I have to ask you about the significance of the millennial vote, a story that you followed throughout the campaign.
Yeah, this one is interesting. And first, this is the first election where millennials, eligible voters, outnumber baby boomers. So really, if you look at that, they could be an unstoppable force. Look at what happened in the federal election. Justin Trudeau targeted the millennials in the federal election campaign, and in fact, it increased by almost 20%, which helped him obtain his majority. So if they get out there and vote, they could make a big difference in this campaign. However, a lot of them I talked to said, I don't know the issues. I'm not going to go vote. And that just drives me crazy, especially as political junkies. They need to get out there and vote.
Thanks, Hannah. The CBC's Hannah Thibodeau. That is a wrap for our special extended edition of Power in Politics, but the excitement of election night is only just beginning. Dwight Drummond and Rosemary Barton are standing by to bring you all the results and reaction in this closely fought campaign. I'll be joining them along with Eric Grenier, Mike Wise, and reporters across the province. If you're watching us on CBC TV, now is the time to switch over to CBC News Network so you don't miss a minute of the action. I'm Vassy Kapelos. I'll be back here tomorrow with all the political reaction to the Ontario election. We're handing things over now to Dwight Drummond.